call this regular meeting of the City Council to order and state that all council members are present through teleconferencing. Someday we'll be out of teleconferencing, but for now. Today I get to lead the council in the Pledge of Allegiance. And thank you, Teresa, for putting up the pledge. So if you're able, please follow me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. As probably many of you did, this weekend being Martin Luther King weekend, in observance of him, I spent some time reflecting on where we've come today and where we continue to change and move. And reading the pledge just kind of reminds me about the One Nation. And I attended a virtual rally, I guess you would say, from Ventura's Martin Luther King Committee, and talking about one nation just kind of reminded me of one people and one nation and one dream, and just that we are all here today to try to continue to move us forward. And I've had a lot of comments lately to me personally of saying, oh, well, you're mayor, you were elected, it's fine, we're equal now. So I just, kind of reminding everyone to really think about, we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And I guess that's just all I wanted to say about that. So moving forward, today we obviously are meeting a little bit early today for the study session about the 2021 state legislative briefing. And we will be still having public comments about items that are not on the agenda, but we'll go ahead and do that public comment after the legislative briefing. So today we will have staff present the report on the 2021 state legislative briefing, which I believe will be Georgina Bailey.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'm going to just jump in and cover the first part of it. So I don't know, Georgina, if you want to share your slides and go ahead and put the slide up there, that'd be great.
Yes, definitely will do.
All right, there we go. Thank you. So with that, members, Mayor, members of the council, so our recommendation tonight is to receive and file the 2021 legislative briefing. We'll provide an overview of the adopted laws from the 2021 regular session from December of December of 2020 through October of 2021. Next slide. So by way of background, it was a very busy legislative cycle. As the staff report outlines, we had 770 new bills that were signed into law. And the League of California published the 2021 legislative report, which includes an overview of the laws that were signed into law. It's not all 772 of them. It's really the laws that really pertain to the cities. And so we've provided that as an attachment to the staff report. We were active last year in submitting 9 letters to the state legislature on the LEDGE platform. As a result, we did oppose league and supported the league lobbying efforts on AB 339, and which significantly increased public meeting requirements, and SB 556, which would have restricted local control over public infrastructure, and they were both vetoed by the governor. We also worked with Senator Laird's office in response to 1383, in which now SB 70 includes $60 million in grant funding, and thanks, Councilmember Marks, for all the funding that's been directed to us, and she's been making us available, funding that's available to IWMA and the city. And then most notably is SB 9 was approved despite the league and the city's opposition to the measure. So, and we'll talk about that tonight as part of the presentation. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So we've got 7 areas tonight that we'll be running through as part of the legislative briefing. And so I'm going to turn it over to Georgina, and she's going to walk you through the presentation and walk you through the organization and give you a couple cues so we can just use that as a placeholder. We have made some modifications to the slide deck from what we sent you on Friday to try to shorten it up. And so she'll walk you through some of those changes as well.
Happy to, and good evening, Council. Tonight, we're going to go over the state's new laws, which were adopted during the 2021 legislative session. The presentation is broken into 7 categories, which are listed on the screen. These categories correspond with the 2021 League of California Cities legislative report and how they have categorized them. There is a lot to cover, and to keep track of where we are in the presentation, in the footer of each slide will be the category of legislation that we are on. We have over 50 laws to get through, and I want to leave time for all of your questions. I've timed myself and should be able to get through this in about half an hour, which will leave plenty of time for questions. However, in an effort to do that, please hold questions until the end, and staff, also as a reminder, staff from each department are available tonight to answer any questions you may have on any of the new laws. And we'll get started with the first section, which is on budget and trailer bills. So on June 28th, 2021, Governor Newsom signed Assembly Bill 128 into law, which represented the preliminary budget between the legislature and the administration. And then shortly after, on July 12th, adopted Senate Bill 129, which made significant amendments to the initial budget. But included in the adopted budget is funding from the state that supports many programs and initiatives which will impact jurisdictions through the state, which includes housing and homelessness funding, climate resilience funding, and disaster preparedness. And it also expands broadband infrastructure funding. While some of these measures don't result in direct funding to the city, I wanted to note them because the city will see benefits of those measures throughout the state as communities gain greater access to broadband, greater climate resilience, and more affordable housing, which were all issues on the council's 2021 legislative platform. However, I did also want to highlight, though, that the legislature adopted several budget measures that provide direct support to cities through grant opportunities, including grants for affordable housing programs related to zero emission vehicles, homelessness, streets, roads, and wildfire prevention. All departments and programs that are eligible for state grant funding will look into the parameters of funding, and if eligible, will apply for grant funding in line with City Council policies and procedures. Staff also have an additional resource to support grant writing and grant submission through an existing grant partner with the city, and are able to utilize that partnership when applying for grants. And, just to highlight, for example, Assembly Bill 149, Public Works is planning to submit a grant application regarding Choro Undercrossing to support the Anholm Neighborhood Greenway. So that's just one of the grant opportunities they will apply for. Moving on to the next section, which is environmental quality. While the state did adopt some laws that focus on climate action, the legislature saw a lot of highly ambitious climate bills stall out in the legislature this year, and more climate action measures are expected to be introduced or continued next year. The climate measures that are being signed into law, staff is going to work to integrate into existing programs and work items as applicable. However, most of the measures won't have any impact to departments that are substantial. But with that, the first bill I wanted to go over is Senate Bill 52, which just gives more agency to local jurisdictions on declaring local emergencies. This measure clarifies planned power shutoff events qualify as de-energization events for which a local emergency can be declared. Likewise, Senate Bill 708 is similar to Senate Bill 52 in that it gives more agency to water distributors in the event of a planned power outage to declare an emergency without a public hearing. Moving on to Assembly Bill 33, this measure expands to local governments the eligibility to fund projects under the California Energy Commission Energy Conservation Assistance Account to now include installation of energy storage systems, such as backup batteries and electric vehicle infrastructure, which is just another option for funding for local governments to fund critical energy infrastructure. Senate Bill 437 requires local publicly owned electric utilities to update their integrated resource plan to include details of the utility's electrical service rate design, that supports transportation electrification and existing or planned incentives to support transportation electrification. And staff will implement that and update the resource plan as necessary, but staff is already working on efforts to support transportation electrification throughout the city. Assembly Bill 1276 is a more noteworthy law, as the measure requires food and beverage accessories such as single-use condiments and plastic silverware be only available upon request. And this will include food facilities who use third parties for their takeout, food, order, and delivery. So staff will review this legislation and return to City Council before the measure takes effect, and to update City Council on the recommended implementation of this measure. Senate Bill 237 was co-authored by California Association of Sanitation Agencies and Cal Coast Keepers, and it allows the city and other wastewater treatment agencies the authority to divert, treat, and dispose of stormwater and urban runoff. Before this legislation, it was done on a case-by-case basis. It's not something that the city currently does. However, this would allow the city in the future to treat liquid waste in the sanitary sewer if needed, instead of discharging polluted waters into the creek. Senate Bill 323 gives public agency water and sewer rates the same protections already afforded to fees and charges that fund other essential government services. The 120 days for a validation action included as a part of this measure were already in place for other utilities and now are extended to water and sewer. And in other good news, the adoption of Assembly Bill 9 and Senate Bill 63 give more grant opportunities from the state for the city to apply for. And in this instance, Assembly Bill 9 and Senate Bill 63 give grant funding to support regional wildfire preparedness and mitigation and fire prevention and education. And the fire department is going to investigate the parameters of this funding and apply as appropriate to grants that are offered. Moving on to the next section, which is governance, transparency, and labor relations. During the legislative session, the legislator adopted several laws that will impact local elections and campaign contributions for public officials. However, these laws will not substantially impact local elections and public official campaign contributions in the city, as the city has its own locally adopted standards. However, Assembly Bill 319 does prohibit contribution expenditures and independent expenditures by foreign governments and foreign principals in connection with state and local candidate elections. Likewise, Senate Bill 686 just requires more transparency in campaign disclosures for LLCs. Assembly Bill 37 was a city council supported measure, which is now being signed into law, and it requires that county election officials mail a ballot to every registered voter for all elections. Assembly Bill 361 will not impact the city's current teleconferencing practices like we are doing right now, as the city is already complying with current state laws. The only impact of this measure is that it extends the date of teleconferencing regulations during state emergencies to January 1st, 2024. On to the next section, which is housing, community, and economic development. There are quite a few new laws regarding housing, community, and economic development. And when I went through them with staff, we've categorized the laws into laws that already exist within ordinances and policies, are limited in their applicability, or require further study and possible updates. So the table you see on your screen, all of these new laws are either included in existing ordinances and policies or have limited to no applicability for city policies. And some of the laws that are categorized for both, such as Assembly Bill 345, 215, 787, the parts of the laws that are applicable have already been incorporated into ordinances and policies, and the parts of the laws that are not applicable exist separately and will not impact the department substantially, if at all. And the good news is that the city largely has already incorporated many of the new housing and economic development laws into either city ordinance or city policies. And this can be attributed to the city getting ahead of a lot of affordable housing laws and staying up to date on housing and community development best practices. There are some laws where we will need to continue to follow the lead from the state on how to implement them. However, the city is not in conflict with any of these state laws. However, moving on to more exciting and noteworthy legislation. such as Senate Bill 9. This will have an impact on the city and require further study and possible future ordinance modifications, which are being considered with current housing work. Senate Bill 9 requires a proposed urban lot split or housing development containing 2 residential units within a single family residential zone to be considered ministerially without discretionary review or hearing if the proposal meets certain requirements. However, local agencies are allowed to apply additional objective zoning, subdivision, and design review standards as long as those standards do not physically preclude construction of 2 residential units of at least 800 square feet on each lot. Likewise, in regard to Senate Bill 10, this bill authorizes a local government to adopt an ordinance to zone any parcel for up to 10 units of residential density per parcel at a height which is specified within the ordinance. Staff has been and will continue to monitor issues and engage with planners locally across the state to better understand the full range of development opportunities and challenges created by Senate Bill 10 and respond accordingly. If the city did want to enact an ordinance within the parameters of the state law, we could. However, it's not something that's currently planned for review in the near term. And lastly, for this section, Senate Bill 478. This measure prohibits the city from imposing a floor area ratio standard, which is less than 1.0 on a housing development project, which consists of 3 to 7 units, or less than 1.25 on a housing development project that consists of 8 to 10 units. This is another law that's going to require further review and could require possible updates, and staff will review and bring back to council as necessary. Moving on to the next section, which is public safety. The legislature did prioritize public safety and police reform during this year's legislative session, largely due to the civil unrest during the summer of 2020. And in this section, I've highlighted some of the legislation that the city council should be aware of as the police department works to incorporate all of the new laws into the department's operations and policies as applicable. Starting with Senate Bill 98. This measure requires that reporters may access areas shut off by police for a command post, police line, or rolling closure at a demonstration or rally where individuals are engaged primarily in constitutionally protected activity. Likewise, Assembly Bill 26 requires law enforcement policies to include a requirement for officers to immediately report potential excessive force. Assembly Bill 48 prohibits the use of kinetic energy projectiles or chemical agents to disperse an assembly, a protest, or demonstration, except to defend against a threat to life or serious bodily injury, or to bring an objectively dangerous situation safely and effectively under control. Notably, this measure prohibits kinetic energy projectiles and chemical agents used solely for a violation of an imposed curfew, a verbal threat, or noncompliance with a law enforcement directive. Assembly Bill 57 will require a basic peace officer course curriculum to include instruction on the topic of hate crimes and incorporates a specified hate crime video developed by the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training, or POST. Assembly Bill 89 increases the minimum qualifying age for law enforcement officers from 18 to 21 and requires the Office of the Chancellor of the California Community Colleges to develop a modern policing degree by June 1st, 2023, and staff will track and implement as necessary. Assembly Bill 481 requires that a law enforcement agency obtain approval of the applicable governing body, in this case, City Council, the adoption of a military equipment use policy by ordinance at a regular meeting prior to taking actions relating to the funding, acquisition, or use of military equipment. Assembly Bill 490 prohibits a law enforcement agency from authorizing techniques or transport methods that involve a substantial risk of potential asphyxia. Assembly Bill 958 defines a law enforcement gang as a group of law enforcement officers within an agency that engages in a pattern of specified unlawful or unethical on-duty behavior, and requires that those law enforcement agencies have a policy prohibiting those gangs and making participation in them grounds for termination. Assembly Bill 1475 prohibits a police department or sheriff's office from sharing on social media, booking photos of an individual arrested on suspicion of committing a nonviolent crime. Senate Bill 2 strips minor state immunity provisions for malicious prosecution, negligent injury of a prisoner, and failure to provide medical aid. In addition, the law directs posts to create a process to decertify officers for serious misconduct, and decertified officers will no longer be able to be licensed in the state of California for law enforcement work. Senate Bill 16 expands the categories of police personnel records which are subject to disclosure under the California Public Records Act to include a sustained finding involving force that is unreasonable or excessive, and or any sustained finding that an officer failed to intervene against another officer using unreasonable or excessive force. And lastly, for this section is Senate Bill 715, which authorizes the Attorney General to investigate and gather facts in an incident involved by a peace officer that results in a death of a civilian if there is a reasonable dispute as to whether the civilian was armed. It's also just worth noting, as we're about halfway through the presentation, if council has any questions on these laws or others that are discussed, department heads and staff are available for questions after the presentation. On to the next section, which is revenue and taxation. There's only one bill of note, which is on fines related to short-term rentals or to our city homestays. So Senate Bill 60 gives cities the ability to raise maximum fines for residential short-term rental violations for infractions that pose a threat to health or safety. However, the city currently does not issue infraction violations for residential short-term rentals. Our last section is transportation, communication, and public works. The legislature did adopt several transportation, communication, and public works measures that will have some impacts on the city and its current work efforts. Starting with Assembly Bill 970, this measure requires a local authority to reduce the number of required parking spaces for an existing use by the amount necessary to accommodate electrical vehicle charging stations, and also deem electrical vehicle charging applications complete and approved in a timely manner. So staff will need to review the current parking application requirements and will incorporate this new law. Assembly Bill 537 similarly requires the city to notify an applicant of a incomplete telecommunication application within a time period that's specified by the FCC rules, and also requires that the time period for the city to approve or disapprove that application when the applicant makes the first required submission or takes the first step. And like the other bill, staff will need to review the current telecommunications facility application requirements and incorporate that new law. In regard to Senate Bill 378, this requires local agencies to allow micro-trenching for the installation of underground fiber if the installation in the micro-trench is limited to fiber. And the measure also authorizes local agencies to impose fees to recover costs for permitting. The city's municipal code currently addresses excavation and trenching. However, micro-trenching standards will need to be updated in line with this new law as a part of Public Works 2022 standard update. Moving on to Assembly Bill 443, staff is tracking the implementation of Assembly Bill 43 closely, and this measure will provide greater flexibility for setting speed limits in order to address safety concerns. Portions of Assembly Bill 43 are able to be implemented immediately, such as the ability to designate 20 to 25 mile per hour speed zones in downtown districts, and the ability to retain existing posted speed limits for additional years. However, some portions of this measure are contingent upon statewide implementation of an online citation program, which could take up until 2024 for the state to implement. Currently, under Assembly Bill 43, the city could establish 20 mile per hour zones in streets in the downtown core if desired via an ordinance, and can also retain current speed limits for up to 14 years, even if updated studies showed that 85th% speeds have increased. Currently, we have to update this every 7 to 10 years, but under this new law, we could expand it up to 14 years. In regard to Assembly Bill 773, staff is tracking this as it authorizes a local authority to adopt a rule or regulation to implement a slow street program, and this measure will help the city's parklet program as the legislation increases the city's justification to retain street closures for parklets. Another noteworthy bill is Senate Bill 640, which allows 2 or more eligible cities or 1 or more cities and a county to combine resources on a project that will affect multiple jurisdictions. The law also consolidates reporting requirements into a single report, which will make it easier for cities to provide required information when submitting for funding. Currently, the Senate Bill 614 will not impact any projects planned for the city, but will allow greater flexibility in the future for joint city and county projects using that account funding. Previously, agencies had to submit projects to the California Transportation Commission separately, but with this bill's adoption, agencies will be able to work together to pool funding for infrastructure projects that could have a shared benefit to the region. And the last legislation of tonight is Senate Bill 814. This expands the definition of a pedicab to include electric bicycles and expands the definition of a bicycle to include electric bicycles. Currently, pedicabs are limited through permit issuance on which streets they can operate and are issued through the city's police department. This measure could increase the number of pedicab permits that are issued and could maybe impact the amount of pedicabs operating on streets, and staff will implement this measure as applicable. And with that, we are at the end of the presentation. I know that was a lot to cover. I am happy to go back to any slide in the presentation for discussion, and myself and staff from all appropriate departments are available to field any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you, Georgina. That was fantastic. Councilmember Pease.
Yeah, excellent work. Super to get kind of a concise from the Cal cities, and then to break it down to even more directly applicable to the city is super helpful. So thank you for that. There were a couple of housing bills that were on the not applicable, not a big impact, but I just wanted to follow up on. So AB 345, the ADUs with separate conveyance. That seemed like kind of a big deal, and maybe I just don't understand how it works, or maybe it doesn't need additional city action, but it will take its own course. My understanding is that somehow you could sell an ADU separately from the house, the property that sits on. Is that what that is saying?
Yeah, I'm happy to bring in Michael Codron, who can also give some more detail.
I'm trying to bring Michael over. Michael, if you're listening,
I do know some of that answer though, just to start it, and then Michael can chime in. So when we looked at it, there are a lot of conditions that are required for to be able to sell that accessory dwelling unit, and so that staff will have to look into that more. But it based in the initial reading, it didn't seem like it would be a huge impact. But I'll let Michael also discuss it.
Good evening, everyone. Michael Codron, Director of Community Development, and thank you, Georgina. I think you covered it. We've had the chance to review the actual bill language, and there are a number of criteria for eligibility that don't really ring a bell with projects in the city of San Luis Obispo. So they require that this original subdivision occur as part of a common interest development. And then also there's a provision in there for nonprofit housing providers. So if the nonprofit housing provider is an owner, there's some provisions in there as well. And we'll be drilling down on the details of that one, but don't see it being an immediate.
So not a free-for-all. Great, thanks. And then my second question on the housing ones is AB 215, the housing element and the violations. Again, we noted it as not particularly applicable, but I saw that Cal Cities was pretty concerned about that. They kind of singled that one out. So I just want to follow up a little bit more. Are we still looking at it, or because we won't be in violation, then we're not as concerned? Or
yeah, I think we're still looking at all of these, and actually attended a webinar today that was hosted by the HVACC and Home Builders Association of the Central Coast, and it was a presentation provided by two of the top folks from Housing and Community Development's new enforcement unit. So it was nice to hear their presentation, and that's been recorded, so we'll have a chance to review that further. Not a lot of detailed discussion about, in terms of what the specific plans are, but they're engaged in working on it. So we expect more specific guidance from HCD on this particular measure. In terms of where we stand with the housing element, we've just received our certification, within the past 6 months. At the end of 2021, we're in really good shape now, but we're going to be making sure that we are, with our inclusionary housing ordinance update. One of the purposes of that project is to make sure we're not in violation of any housing element requirements as it relates to the way that we process affordable housing deeds and the way we qualify eligible households. And we'll continue to engage with HCD because as we learn more about specifically how they're enforcing and what are the most important things for them, we will certainly be engaged and on top of that.
Awesome, thank you. Great,
Yeah.
and then I have one more question that's not specific to housing or any one item, but it was about, and you touched on this in terms of getting the money for all these new programs. I mean, on all those little budget pieces, it's like, millions here, a few million there, et cetera. So it sounds like staff kind of individually, or each department goes through and says, gosh, we have a project that might line up, or is there kind of like a central clearinghouse? And then what's the role of the grant writer kind of partnership? Do we have professionals out there looking for grants that we could work toward? And what's our process for going after some of these new monies that we're seeing come together?
It's all of the above, I would say.
Yeah.
We do have the team that Bob Hill supports out of city administration. That's a great resource to sort of dive in on grants and facilitate the application process and to give us good reads on eligibility and criteria. But for our part in community development, our housing policy and program group independently evaluates grant applications that align with and match our work program. So what we're not necessarily looking for grants to do work that we wouldn't have otherwise done. But for example, we have grants right now for our safety element update. That was a Caltrans grant. When we updated our general plan, we had a sustainable communities grant, and there's a new NOFA on that grant. So we're going to be looking at that. We also have housing planning grants for our flexible density program that we're working on. And those are all, some of the funding from those grants were built into the 2021-23 financial plan, and we're sort of the source of funding for our work program. So it's all of the above, but we are tuned into the housing specific grants, particularly because it's been a goal of the city councils for so long.
And just to put a fine point on that, Bob Hill does manage that group. We do have outside consulting support that we use for grant writing and also prospecting of grants as well. And it has proven an incredible investment by our city. I think we've shared with you a lot of the grants we've been successful on, from parks grants to energy grants to housing grants. And so it has been a force multiplier to use that resource. And so it does, of course, require active participation from all the departments because they're the subject matter experts to kind of feed the content into the grant applications. And then if we are successful, then the department then takes over the administration and responsibility for the grant and the accompanying reporting, which usually is the case.
Awesome. Seems like there's some good opportunities coming up. We'll have to.
Yeah, and you'll see that Councilmember Pease with the mid-year, we're just, between the funding that's in the state budget and the anticipated funding that's coming from the federal budgets. I think I forecasted this as part of the financial plan that, with the stream of funding that will probably fit into a lot of existing projects and programs that the city has. We need to be poised and be ready. And so we've tried to get projects either shovel ready, which means permits, et cetera, or, we've just tried to get the programs in alignment, we think, with where the state and the feds are going to land. And so you'll see as part of the mid-year budget, we're going to have to do some load shifting on work if we're going to have Bob and his mind ready to kind of field all of the opportunities that will be coming and then kind of steer the ship with the other departments.
Right. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Shoresman. You are muted.
Gosh darn, I remembered to put my hand down and I forgot to unmute myself. Too many buttons to push. But while I was going to say, while we've got our community development director up, I've got a couple more housing related questions. Just wondered if he could describe, I know this wasn't under the list of laws that wouldn't have impact, so I'm assuming it's still being looked at, but SB 478 had some somewhat technical language about floor area ratio standards for different numbers of units. And I know that gets kind of complicated for the layperson, and it does for me as well, even after being on the planning commission. So I'm wondering if he can explain that a little bit.
Well, it looks like it's, I don't have specific details about 478. I don't think we have any issues complying with this. But it looks like what it is an attempt to enable more housing that might be restricted right now by objective design standards or other types of standards that are overly restrictive. So I'm just, I would have to compare this, these floor area ratios of 1.0 and 1.25. I'd have to compare that to our zoning standards, and I don't have that right in front of me at the moment, but we'll be taking a look at this for sure as well, especially given the concern.
Great. And I know we've talked some about SB 9 and its impact on the city, and the Planning Commission saw a presentation about it. But I wondered about SB 10. I know that's been in the news a little bit. Sorry, I made our slide person bounce around. And I know with SB 9, there isn't going to be that much impact just because there aren't that many properties that it would apply to. I wondered about SB 10.
Yeah, no, I think SB 10 is actually an important planning tool for cities that want to approach areas for rezoning, because what it includes that isn't really detailed here are CEQA exemptions for the work. So it allows local agencies to do some advanced planning for areas that they want to receive increased density, in infill sites, transit-rich areas. But this facilitates that process because it doesn't require an extensive CEQA review. So I have, reviewed SB 10 and think it's a potential where we might, to the extent that we could use that exemption and follow the SB 10 criteria for the city's flexible density project, we may do that.
Great. And then just one more question about AB 77.3 and its impact on street closures and bikeways and pedestrian access. I think I saw Luke in the waiting room. I don't know if he can be brought in to talk about that, or if you want to tackle that one.
I'm bringing Luke over right now.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Excellent. Yes, so this measure, while is beneficial to us to provide more support and justification for things like parklets and potential for temporary street closures for things like improved bicycle or pedestrian circulation or special events, The focus of this specific legislation was for cities that were doing more of these slow street programs where they're completely closing streets to through traffic, or doing more pilot projects with this. This is legislation that gives them a path forward that aligns with the vehicle code moving forward to continue doing things like that. That hasn't been a program that we've been focusing on. We've really been focusing on parklets, which don't technically close the road to traffic. They really isolate a portion of the shoulder or parking lane to act as a temporary extension of the sidewalk.
Not too much impact that you can see from this one.
No, basically, when we return to the council later this year with recommendations on a permanent parklet program, it basically just gives us another piece of formal code to cite to support using the street, the functional street width for things like that. But really the focus of it was for cities that plan to really look at closing streets or continue temporary closures that have been in place during the pandemic. Well, that's not something that we've been focusing on. It still gives more support for the things that we are doing.
Great, thank you so much. That's my last question.
Great, thank you so much. And while we have Michael still, I have one question for you. As far as, I know we talked a little bit about the zoning and what has to change and what doesn't, as far as the housing plan that you were sharing earlier that we just, or housing element that we just had approved. But sorry, I just lost my page, apologize. But as far as the inclusionary housing that we'll be talking about next month, do you see that we'll be updating updating with SB 290 and the density bonus law? Do you see we'll be updating what that is requiring into our new inclusionary plan?
Yes, I think we will. It's in terms of our update to the ordinance for inclusionary housing, we've at the end of last year, we presented a new nexus study to the city council, which identified sort of the maximum amount of affordable housing that we have a legal nexus to require as a government agency. And as we look at that, we're also overlaying a financial feasibility component because if we required the absolute maximum number of affordable housing units that we have a nexus to, that would probably stop most residential development from occurring. And so we want to find that balance where the development continues to move forward, but we're getting more affordable housing, let's say. And so we have to take that 290 into account to ensure that that the inclusionary housing program is consistent. But on some of these, on 290, the provisions of 290 may apply whether or not we are dealing with a project that's implementing inclusionary housing. And so we've got to look at 290 both in terms of how our inclusionary housing ordinance can respond to it, but also how it applies to other projects and make sure that we're consistent across the board.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Marks.
Thank you. Yeah, this is just kind of a general question regarding the new laws that affect the police department, our city's police department. If changes are made, how will the public and the council be informed about those changes in response to these new laws? In other words, are we going to get a report if our police department does make changes? Will council and the public get a report on what those changes are and have a chance to comment in some way?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council and staff. I'm Chief Rick Scott, and yes, absolutely. As we go through the legislative briefing, this is really just a primer for what I think is a larger project, a larger discussion, both with council and with our community. And so what we're going to do later, closer to April, we're actually scoping a project to bring in a consultant to help us with our 5-year strategic plan. And part of that plan is going to be community engagement. There's several opportunities and avenues that we're going to pursue throughout our community to talk to not only to Cal Poly, to our neighborhoods, to our business owners, marginalized community members, and even those that are consuming our homeless services, to make sure that we're getting input from all angles of our community. Once we have that collected, we're going to be bringing that information back to council through our reporting mechanisms.
Great. Thank you so much. And that's my only question.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. At this time, oh, sorry, I have one other question. I don't know if you had time, City Manager, to find out, have there been many officers that were hired in 21?
Great question. And Chief Scott, this came up during agenda review today, whether or not we had officers. I couldn't, and both the city attorney and I couldn't recount whether we had officers that were younger than 21 that have been hired onto our staff, and whether or not what the effect of the new law would be.
So to the best of my recollection, I believe historically we had one that we hired before they were 21. We actually had to buy their training bullets to go into the academy for them. But once they graduated the academy, they had their 21st birthday before they were out on the street. I think that's a great law. I think 21, in my opinion, is a reasonable age for the minimum for a police officer.
Thank you. And then as far as kind of to follow up on Councilmember Marks's question, it seems like there's some of these new laws that don't have a specific date. So when we talk about the tear gas or the military purchases, what's your thoughts around timelines and when we'll see action?
Great. Yeah, I think what's really exciting about the laws and what we've seen this legislative session is we're actually putting police reform into action. This is the first time we've had this volume of laws that actually speak to the issues we need to address as a profession. I'm happy to report the department has already done a cursory analysis on all the impacts of the legislation that we went over tonight. Each one of these laws have already been codified in our policies and procedures, and we are compliant today with all the laws that were passed. The one thing you will see later this year, possibly in the spring, is going to be on the military equipment. We do need to come before council with a presentation on the items that we do have, how they're used, and what the results of those uses have been, as well as a procedure when we buy equipment into the future. That's a very long and detailed law. So when we talk about military equipment, it's not necessarily equipment that we get from the military. A lot of this comes from regular suppliers that we use, and that could be anywhere from tear gas to even the pistols that we buy or the rifles that we use. All that will fall under this new law, and so we'll bring that back to you possibly as soon as the spring.
Thank you. And as far as the mug shots on social media, I know that we talked about this earlier in agenda review, that the social media youth may still use to try to find someone, but it just won't be for those who are being booked. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. If we have a person of interest or somebody we need help, the public's help identifying, we're okay putting that information out there to help us gather information to solve a crime. However, if you've been arrested and booked for these lower level offenses, those that don't include violence, the law does prohibit us from putting a mugshot out there for all to see.
Great, thank you. And my last question is actually for Christine. We talked a little bit in agenda review as far as the body cams when it comes to SB 16, the peace officers and release of records. I just thought it'd be nice for you to share out to the public, City Attorney, about how the body cams are relating to the personnel records.
Sure, it's very typical for body cam to be part of an investigatory file that would result in discipline. That's a covered discipline under both existing statutes and the expansion of the existing statutes that's represented here. And to the extent that that footage wasn't subject to some other exemption, would be disclosable as part of the investigatory file for the covered offenses, for the covered disciplinary measures.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, well, seeing no other hands from my colleagues, I'm going to go ahead and move forward to, do you need someone to officially receive the report, City Manager? or Georgina?
There's no action that's required with it. It's just the recommendation. So we file it in the record. This is something we, as far as to my knowledge, we haven't done before, but as the legislature has been much more active, we will be much more diligent in having this conversation with the council, because I think this helps kind of then the council and whoever the council should choose to be on the ad hoc committee to tune up the legislative platform, kind of cue in and narrow in on how we might want to focus our advocacy over the next year.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Pease.
I had just a couple of minor comments, but I didn't know if there was public comment on this item.
I think we are moving to that next. All right, city clerk, do you see any hands up? This is our chance for the public to go ahead and raise your virtual hand if you'd like to speak on this item, the study session of legislative briefing. We'll be calling two names at one time. And when your name is called, look for a pop-up and click where indicated so you can be promoted to a panelist to provide your comments. City clerk, any hands at this time?
No, there are not.
Okay, then we'll go back to my colleagues and Councilor Pease.
Thanks so much. I wanted to say thank you for this, having this presentation, City Manager. I think you're exactly right about wanting to stay on top of this, and kind of along the same lines, wanted to just give a shout out to so much of our staff who have been behind the scenes doing the analysis, but also doing the advocacy and assessment all along. And those who serve on the Cal Cities Advocacy Committee. Mayor Stewart and I are both currently serving on committees for Cal Cities that advises on the Cal Cities platform. But I know there's staff serving as well. So when you do this in the future, it'd be great to give them a shout out. And thanks also to our city attorney's office for all the letters and analysis for those positions that we do take at the city. That's it. Oh, and I really do appreciate the law enforcement kind of legislation. I think, as Chief Scott noted, that it's really positive, decertification and some of these really key issues that we've all collectively been wanting. And so it's been great to see the state step up with some really good processes.
Absolutely, thank you. Councilmember Shorsman.
Ditto to what Councilmember Pease said. I just really appreciate all the work put into this. And I also just think that this is a really good, just a reference list and summary that I know I'm going to keep on my desktop for a while and be able to use it as a reference. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I also very much agree. I am so thankful for all the time. I mean, I know in last year we had some discussions in the community of actions people would have liked us to have taken faster. But we knew from the many conversations that were happening at the state level that these were things that were going to be at a much higher level and have more of an impact and change. So very exciting. Looks like we'll get to really see some help in finances as well as in making some transportation change, housing increases, and obviously police reform. So thank you very much, Georgina, and to all the department heads and city manager and city attorney's office. At this point, we'll go ahead and receive and file this report. Do you need a first and second on this? No, right? Great, thank you.
We'll just note for the record that there was that the report was received and filed.
Great, thank you so much. Well, next we have the city manager report. Go ahead and switch gears. And I know you have to get the slideshow up. And after the city manager report, we will have public comment for items not on the agenda. So if there's anyone in the audience that has something to add, we will bring you in at that time.
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Just a few items I want to share with the council. Hopefully, some of you made it down to Mission Plaza. It's our ongoing activation with our partners in the arts community. And so we have our first 3D chalk art done by Katie McGrath at Badger Branding. I had a chance to drop by a couple times this weekend and over MLK Day yesterday, and saw lots of families and friends taking pictures and just really enjoying themselves in the plaza. And so I'm really encouraged about this kind of activation and the partnership that we have with many of the co-creators here in San Luis Obispo. And you'll see more of that coming soon. We also have some new parking apps, and I know we've been talking about this for quite some time. So visitors in downtown can use parking apps to pay for on-street parking. We have Park Mobile, Park Smarter, Pay by Phone, and Honk, and we have another one on the way as well. So I know that this was at times frustrating for the community, for us, as we adopted, and we were a leader in adopting a platform. So it wasn't just one provider, but we adopted a system so that many apps, I think it's up to 10 apps, can work with this. So if you are using this on campus, or you're in Paso Robles or Pismo Beach, you come here, you don't have to download another app, because we know how much we love to do that, and then sign up and then to pay for parking. So, and the city's pay stations are still available. You can still use coins and bills, and they're found on every block downtown. We'll be coming as part of our mid-year discussion, as we've rolled out the program, we've really seen that there's some areas that we need to expand these parking pay stations. It was shared with me earlier today, I guess, that we are the last city in the county has moved forward with these pay stations, and so we've got some more work that we'll be doing over the next few months. I also want to provide an update on housing updates, on just a little bit on some of our housing units, and just give you some updates in terms of 21 calendar year production. We saw one tiny home. We saw 282 multi units issued, 35 mixed use permits, a total of ADUs issued 72, and over 153. So production in San Luis Ranch is continuing at a similar pace. You're seeing a significant amount of construction along Orcutt, in the Orcutt area, specific plan area. And our first Avila Ranch permits are getting ready for issuance. So they've done a lot of the site work, a lot of the utility work. You can see Buckley Road poking out on South Higuera to make that connection. And so there's a lot of exciting things that are happening on the housing side. And certainly that was a topic of conversation last week at my city manager's discussion about how much housing is happening in SLO. The safe parking program over at Railroad Square has expanded. So we have 20 parking spaces for safe parking. The check-ins from 6 to 7 at night. Parkers must vacate by 7 a.m. It's a 7-day-a-week program. We have on-site porta potties, hand washing stations, and it is being managed in partnership with CAPSO. So we're coordinating individuals in concert with case managers, and trying to look at where they should be, whether it's at 40 Prado, over at Railroad Square, over at Kansas as well. And so we had a topic of conversation ultimately about how to manage this, and we're looking for more volunteers. So if there are faith organizations or others that are interested, and from my experience down in Santa Barbara County, faith organizations had small pods, sometimes 2, 3 in their parking lot. And if you recall, we have a continuing measure in place for safe parking. So we've really eased up the process to allow for our nonprofit partners to have these types of facilities at a variety of locations. Home key funding. SLO County did put out an RFP for home key proposals. I understood they received one up in Atascadero. I know that Haslo is now going to be moving forward with a home key application for Anderson Hotel. And I suspect that when we come to the council on February 15th with the mid-year discussion, and share where we're at with our projected ARPA projections, that the council will have an opportunity as well to perhaps provide additional shot of funding for affordable housing and or for homelessness. But I wanted to update you where we stand today. Tank Farm Orcutt Roundabout project update, and I know the community is very, I would say, interested in the progress in our CIP effort, and certainly we hear from people from time to time, but the Orcutt project is on schedule. It's phase 3 is scheduled to begin in mid-February, and the current project milestones is that we will have this completed by May of 2022. So it's been a little slow going. A lot of it was some of the drainage and utilities work. There was a significant amount of overhead utilities that we needed to underground. And so now that has been, a lot of it pushed out. I rode by yesterday. There were the construction team was out there working on some of the grades for the sidewalks and some of the other pedestrian facilities, and that should shape up here pretty soon. The Parks and Rec office renovations. So the council did fund significant renovation over at Parks and Rec. It's been about 25 years since I think we last had it update of the facility, and it's also in support of some of the changes that we need to support the staff for our Parks and Rec blueprint for the future. We expect that the project will be completed by June of 2022, and all of our fine Parks and Rec staff have moved over to the Ludwig Community Center, and they've got offices, phones, and other things that are set up there for them. 919 Palm Street's temporary counter closure, and early on, late last week, communicated to the team that just given where we were with Omicron and the impacts to staff, that they were authorized at the department head level to close down any sort of operations or public counters based upon infections. And so I got word today from Mr. Cadron that we're going to be doing that tomorrow. And so if staff is always available by appointment, and you can phone the number there, or you can also access staff through digital services Monday through Friday from 8 to 3. And then we're going to be reassessing on a weekly basis. I know we've seen this sweep across different industries. Many of you may have caught the article in the Tribune about how it's impacting local hospitality industry. And so we're not immune from that. And so just wanted to communicate with that. And if there's any other public counter changes, we'll make sure we communicate that with both the public and the council as early as possible. Omicron or COVID-19 updates, and I'll jump into some of the data. We are seeing, you'll see that essentially Omicron has become the dominant variant. Masking indoors and vaccinations are encouraged. And we are working from home, that is highly encouraged. So we're maximizing remote work. We do have free rapid tests available here at the city. And I understand that there are some that are being made available for households in the US. As of late, California has confirmed close to about 7 million cases and just over 77,000 deaths. So I'll jump in. Let me go back to this slide a little, got that out of order, my apologies. On COVID-19 update, this is the latest forecast from IHME, at least for California. It shows us on the backside of this current wave. As the bottom graph shows, is that hospitalizations typically lag. And so we'll talk about that later, and certainly look into the county as part of its dashboard of where we stand in terms of both a general hospital and ICU capacity. In terms of new cases, you can see the trend is continued kind of poking upwards, and the case rate is pretty high at 151.2 per 100,000. Hospitalized to date, just over 1,300 ICU today, 200, and deaths today. We've crept up to 380. And unfortunately, we heard from public health today that we had a couple more deaths, and I understand we have more that are pending. To the point I want to clarify, last week, what is the dominant variant over time? The blue line is the Delta variant, which you can see has taken a sharp decline as Omicron now has become the dominant variant here in San Luis Obispo County. Where do we stand at vaccinations? About 72% of Californians are fully vaccinated. Another 8.7 people, 5+ are partially vaccinated. We have about close to almost 68 million doses administered. It's fallen off to about 160,000 doses per day. About 50.7 of the booster recipients. We have a healthy inventory. And you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, about 447,000 doses administered in our county. And from last check, I don't think that there's been significant change between the individuals fully vaccinated or partially vaccinated. Those stand as what I reported last week. So with that, Madam Mayor, that concludes the COVID report, but I just do want to just hop back to the legislative platform and just remind the council, I'm hoping tonight we do need to move forward. Was last updated in spring of 2021. We are looking for an ad hoc committee to review the current platform, the ledge trends, and then forecast kind of city issues, and then present and recommend a platform here in spring. We've been able to do that in the past on consent with active participation of a couple members. So following any questions on the city manager report, Madam Mayor, I request that the council give some thought to looking at 2 members to support the city manager and a city attorney and come back with a marked up ledge platform. And with that, that concludes my report.
Thank you. That was a very thorough and full report. With the COVID report, I believe that there are free tests that people can receive via mail now. I do not have that web address right now in front of me, but I do know that I have it on my social media, and Councilmember Shoresman looks like she might be able to share with us.
COVIDtests.gov. So COVID tests, TESTS.gov.
Thank you so much. And if there are no questions for the city manager, we could talk about the legislative agenda. And as far as the subcommittee, are there any thoughts? I know that Vice Mayor Christensen and Councilmember Pease were on it last time. Councilmember Marks.
I'd be willing to serve on it this time. So, but you know, if other people really want to do it, I also am willing to step back, but I'd be happy to. So thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Christensen, you had your hand up, but no.
Well, I was going to say I've done it the last 2 or 3 times. So if somebody else wants to do it, that's fine. I feel like, you know, I shouldn't be doing it every single time, but I'm always happy to step in if people are busy. I know everybody's got a lot on their plate.
Thank you. Councilmember Pease.
Yes, similar. I don't think I did it. I think I did it 2 times ago, but maybe not last time. So I'm happy to rotate back in. I do think it's interesting, but like Councilmember Christensen, I think it is a good idea to rotate. I don't know if Mayor Stewart, if you want to do that, or if Councilmember Shoresman it seems like kind of a rough thing to throw on the newbie, honestly, unless you're like really into it.
Councilmember Shoresman.
I was just going to ask who had done it the last couple of times. I think I've pretty much got that answer. I'm willing to serve if everybody feels like they've kind of been there, done that. But I also don't want to step in front of you, Madam Mayor, if you would like to do it this time.
Well, I'm quite okay if yourself and Councilmember Marks would like to do this. That would be great, since I think that's what I'm kind of hearing as consensus. And Councilmember Christensen.
Yeah, I'll move that Councilmember Marks and Councilmember Shoresman serve on the Legislative Ad Hoc Committee and work with staff to bring us a recommended update.
I'll second.
Great, sounds good. City Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Christensen,
Yes.
Councilmember Pease,
Yes.
Councilmember Marks,
Yes.
Councilmember Shoresman,
Yes.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. Thank you so much to Council Members Marks and Pease. I really appreciate you stepping in and taking care of this. We really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing the red line version when it comes. All right. Well, any other questions for Council Member Shoresman?
Marks and Shoresman, you meant, right? You said.
So
Marks and
sorry.
Pease.
Yes. Council Member
Okay.
Marks and
Just
Shoresman.
checking.
I apologize. Probably all the Zoom pictures keep moving in front of me, you know. Thank you for that correction. If no other questions for the city manager, we will move on to public comment. I don't see many people in the audience, but I will go ahead and that are not city staff, but I'll go ahead and say it just in case. If there's any members of the public who would like to provide public comment for items not on the agenda, please raise your virtual hand. We'll be calling 2 names at a time, and when your name is called, look for a pop-up and click where indicated so you can be promoted to a panelist to provide your comments. City Clerk, do we have any virtual raised hands at this time?
No, we do not.
Okay, great. Well, then we will move forward. And before we head to the consent agenda, I believe that Councilmember Marks has a comment she would like to provide.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to just address 6D, which is the lease amendment for City Farm at Kaiwaking Agricultural Reserve. I wanted to say that my husband is the chair of the board of that nonprofit. However, he receives no money at all. He just volunteers. And our new home in San Luis Ranch is more than 1,000 feet away from City Farm. I had the city attorney's office and the city clerk's office determined sort of my sphere of having to step down. So I am not going to step down. I think I can be fair, but I did just want to disclose those connections. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Christensen. I'm sorry, Vice Mayor Christensen.
Yes, I'll, assuming that nobody wants to pull anything. Oh, we probably have to do public comment. I was going to make a motion, but I think we have to have public comment on consent. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. You can come back to me.
All right, sounds good. Okay, sorry, my dog is barking in the background. So we'll go ahead and move forward to the consent agenda. And these obviously are usually calendar items that are deemed routine and non-controversial by staff. So unless a member of the council wishes to pull an item for an individual consideration, all items will be approved by one motion. So City Clerk, do we have anyone waiting to provide public comment on the consent agenda?
No, we do not.
Okay, then we have a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Didn't actually make the motion, but I'll go ahead and make it now. I move consent.
Great, thank you so much. Councilmember Pease.
And I'll second that and just shout out to City Farm. How cool is that they, that they want this 40-year lease and have that kind of solid plan for the future. Just really exciting and happy to see that go forward.
Agreed. Thank you. Well, with a motion from Vice Mayor Christensen and seconded by Councilmember Pease, City Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Vice Mayor Christensen,
Yes.
Councilmember Pease,
Yes.
Councilmember Marks,
Yes.
Councilmember Shoresman,
Yes.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, the consent agenda passes unanimously. Thank you so much. Now we'll move forward to the public hearing section of and business item section of our meeting. We have the acceptance of the annual comprehensive financial report, single audit report, and annual audit of Transportation Development Act funds for fiscal year 2021. And I believe I see Debbie and great. Okay, looks like we have all of the staff for presenting this item. Staff, will you go ahead and present the report? You may be muted, Debbie, if you're talking. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure if is
There we go.
Director Elke on the phone, on the call.
I
don't-
don't see her.
Yeah, let me see if she lost connection.
Either.
Oh, wait.
She may-
Brigitte, are you logged in as advisory bodies? Raise your hand.
Let me check online. So Madam Mayor, if you want to just take a quick technical break, where we can check with our finance director, to see where she's at.
Absolutely. Let's do a quick 5-minute break. We will return at 7:55. Okay, we are all back and ready to resume. I don't know if Ms. Malako or Elke, you'd like to start the presentation.
Most certainly. Thank you very much, and a very good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the council. I apologize for this technology hiccup. They seem to continue as we go along on these platforms. But together with your auditor, Mr. Ahmed Badawi, we're very happy to present to you the city's 2020-21 audit and the financial statements. The annual comprehensive financial report has to be published no later than December 31st. And in accordance with this deadline, we made the document publicly available on the city's website on December 23rd. I wanted to clarify that tonight's item includes only the annual comprehensive financial report, as explained in the council report and clarified in a council correspondence. The federal single audit and the Transportation Development Act audit will be before the council on March 15th to allow for a timely submittal by the March 31st deadline for both of these reports. Now, Debbie, are you able to share your screen with the presentation? Otherwise, I can try and do it. Let me see, share. Can you see my screen?
I can.
Wonderful. All righty then. We'll go on to the next slide. And as we see here, the state law and the city's charter require that the city undertake an audit of its financials annually to ensure that the city's financial condition is fairly stated in accordance with general accepted accounting principle. The audit is to be conducted by an independent auditor who reports directly to the City Council. Badawi and Associates are currently under contract for this work, and Mr. Badawi will provide his report directly to you momentarily. But before I hand it over to Mr. Badawi, I would go amiss not to take a moment and thank the auditors as well as the city's accounting team for the hard work that goes into conducting an annual audit, as well as the preparation of the extensive annual comprehensive financial report.
We very much appreciate our collaboration with Mr. Badawi and his team, and your accounting team led by Mrs. Malikote has worked tirelessly to improve processes and work assignments despite ongoing obstacles that we're still encountering with the new ERP system. The timely audit and financial report document would absolutely not be possible without their commitment and dedication to the effort. And with that, I'm actually handing it over to Mr. Badawi for his reports before we then present the financial information that's contained within this year's annual comprehensive financial report.
Well, thank you. And I will also try to share my screen with my presentation. I believe you can see my screen now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So good evening, and thank you for inviting me to the meeting today. I'm Ahmed Badawi, the audit partner on the City of San Luis Obispo's audit. Today, I'll present to you the result of the fiscal year 2021 audit. I'll start here by the agenda and what I'm going to cover today. I will communicate to you who the engagement team was, what were our deliverables in the scope of our audit, the different areas we emphasized on during our audit process, the type of audit report we issued, and provide you some of the required communications, provide you an update on the new accounting standards, and then see if you have any questions or any other discussion items. Of course, feel free to interrupt me if you do have questions at any time. Starting with the engagement team, this was the composition of our engagement team. I was the engagement partner, and I had 4 members working with me, 1 senior and 3 professional staff. Before I actually move on from that slide, I also wanted to mention that we always have an independent reviewer. He's not listed here, but we always have an independent reviewer reviewing our work and the financial statements to ensure that we remain independent in that process. The deliverables in the scope of our audit, we were mainly engaged to provide an opinion on the city's basic financial statements. So that is the annual comprehensive financial report. Also, the city is subject to government auditing standards, which require us to issue a report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters. We are also conducting an audit of the federal grants, the compliance with the federal grants, what we refer to as a single audit, and that is still ongoing with anticipated completion in early February. The Transportation Development Act audit as well, that is anticipated to be issued, I believe, on January 21st, excuse me. We are also conducting the audit of the Whale Rock Commission. We perform and agreed upon procedures on the appropriation limit, and then finally communicating with the governing body, which is what I'm doing today. And we also issue a letter addressed to the council summarizing the scope of the audit and whether we had any disagreement with management and the type of findings that we had. Excuse me. In terms of areas of primary emphasis, we had revenues and receivable as an area of special interest. This is by default an area of a higher risk in any audit that we do. So it's not necessarily unique to San Luis Obispo. Revenues are usually an area of a higher risk due to improper revenue recognition risk, just timing and cutoff and the significance of the accounts. We rely heavily on confirmation from third parties. So we communicate with the county, with the state, with others, depending on the significance, and we confirm with them the amount submitted to the city. We reconcile those to the city's accounting records and make sure that this is what's being properly reported on the financial statements. We also perform a lot of analytical and ratio analysis on the proprietary funds. Pension and OPEB are also an area of higher risk due to complexity of the accounting standard and also the significance of the dollar amount. We normally review the journal entries prepared by management to record the activities in the pension and the OPEB plan. We obtain reports from CalPERS and their auditors, and we trace like cities' plan assets through those auditors' reports. We perform testing of the census data provided by the city to CalPERS and to the OPEB actuary. And then also we review management allocation of pension and OPEB amounts to the various funds. Finally, the risk of management overriding control is a risk that also exists in any audit. Just the fact that management is the one responsible for developing, maintaining, and overseeing those control, they also have the ability to override them. So we design our audit procedures to mitigate that risk, or at least reduce it to an acceptable level. So we normally make sure that we assign more experienced staff to more complex areas, that we incorporate an element of unpredictability in our audit process, that we review the accounting standards followed by the city and make sure that there is consistency there. We do testing of journal entries prepared by management, review of any estimates prepared by management to make sure that they're free of bias, evaluate business rationale for any unusual transactions, and then finally evaluate the appropriateness of fraud-related inquiries performed. So those are just, it's not an all-inclusive list. These are just some summarized procedures that we perform. As for our audit report, we have issued an unmodified opinion. So in very simple terms, that is a clean opinion. That is the highest rating the city can receive. The audit opinion state the standards that were followed. We have followed the generally accepted auditing standard and also government auditing standards. An unmodified opinion means that we believe the financial statements are fairly stated in all material respects, that all significant accounting policies have been consistently applied, that all estimates are reasonable, and that all disclosures are properly reflected in the financial statements. As for our required communications as your independent auditor, this slide will highlight to you the different responsibilities between the audit firm and city management. We are mainly responsible as your independent auditor to provide an opinion on the financial statements, whether they're fairly stated in accordance with US generally accepted accounting principles. We're responsible for evaluating internal control over financial reporting, evaluating compliance with laws and regulations, ensure that the city's financial statements are clear and transparent, and finally, communicating with the city council. Management is ultimately responsible for the financial statements. Our audit does not relieve management from its responsibility towards those financials. Management is responsible for establishing and maintaining internal control over financial reporting, for making financial records available to us during the audit process, for adjusting the financials for any material misstatements, for establishing controls that will prevent and detect fraud, inform us of all known and suspected fraud, comply with laws and regulations, and take corrective action on audit findings. In terms of independence, we are the ones solely responsible for maintaining our independence. So the city doesn't really have to, or the city does not have a responsibility to check whether the firm is independent or not. We look at independence in a variety of ways. We evaluate our firm members. We ask them to sign questionnaires identifying any relationships with either city staff or city council or city management. We make sure to remove those individuals from the audit. We also evaluate any additional service that we offer the city, such as compiling the annual comprehensive financial report. And we make sure that we apply the proper safeguards to maintain our independence during those processes. As for the timing of the audit, we believe that the audit was performed in a time frame communicated to the city in our engagement letter, even though the single audit and the Transportation Development Act are still ongoing, but the main audit was completed on time. On this slide here, every year there are some new accounting standards issued by the Government Accounting Standard Board. We discuss those standards with city management, and the city determine which ones are applicable. We make sure that the city has properly implemented those standards. So these are the ones that were considered by the city during the fiscal year. As I mentioned earlier, some of the numbers in the financial statements are estimated numbers. And that is acceptable as long as there is a reasonable basis behind those estimates. So just wanted to give you some examples of some of those estimated numbers as they're listed here on the slide. Also just wanted to highlight to you some of the important disclosures in the financial statements. the no disclosure section of the financial statements is a narrative part that provide additional information about the different account balances. So for example, an account like cash and investment, the no disclosure would be providing additional information about the different risks that those investments are exposed to, the composition of the investment portfolio, compliance with the city's investment policy and state law, and so on. So each of those notes offer significantly more information that I believe is very helpful to the reader of the financials. Some difficulties encountered during the audit. It's just basically some of the challenges from the prior years in terms of just some of the account balances and how they're reconciled in the closing process. So we will get into that. Definitely no difficulties with management or working with city staff, but just the accounting side of things. And we'll talk about some of those observations and recommendations in the next few slides. There were adjustments and reclassifying entries during the course of the audit, and management has posted all those proposed adjustments. Normally, those adjustments will result from the audit process after management has closed the books and we perform our audit. We may find that some accounts needed some adjustments, and we will propose adjusting entries to correct those. No significant risk or exposure were identified. Legal matters and potential liabilities are disclosed in the financial statements. We normally communicate with legal counsel. We ask them to confirm any outstanding litigations. And most of those litigations don't require specific disclosure just because they're either covered by insurance or just part of the normal course of business, but only really the one that have significant exposure that may not be covered that may require some additional disclosure. It also helps us assess whether the city has properly reserved a proper amount for the outstanding litigations. We're pleased to report that we had no disagreement with management. And in this area, we just some of the deficiencies we found in internal control. So the city had 3 material weaknesses. First, the material weaknesses are the most severe deficiencies in control. They normally mean that there is a good probability that a material error may occur and not be detected by the city's controls. So the first one was the year-end closing and balance sheet reconciliations. This is an ongoing process where every year the city has to go through the closing of the books, capturing transactions that relates to the year, reconciling the different account balances. And this process just, when it was completed and the audit started, we discovered that there were many adjustments that needed to be done after that. The second one was the journal entries posting and numbering. Again, this relates to controls over journal entries, the ability of the preparer to post journal entries without the journal entry being reviewed, and also the numbering system or the multiple numbering systems that are being used by the city that makes it hard for the auditors to ensure that all entries are accounted for, that all entries were provided to us during the audit, just because of the different numbering systems. And the last material weakness was the bank reconciliations. There remain to be some unreconciled differences in the bank. Also the timeliness of the bank reconciliation. The June reconciliation was really completed, I believe, during the audit or shortly after the audit. So there was definitely delay there, and there's still unreconciled differences in there. Some significant deficiencies, so those are a little bit less severe. The payroll module implementation, so the city continued to have issues and continuing to make manual calculations and adjustments to be able to correct what the system is doing. So again, it remains an issue. And then finally, multiple cashiering system reconciliation. There's just city is using multiple cashiering systems, and just the reconciliation of those becomes a challenge. So just wanted to bring that to your attention as well. I think other than that, actually, we did obtain I apologize that this saying we did obtain representations from management before issuing of our reports. Those representations is basically management acknowledging responsibility for the financial statements, acknowledging that they have disclosed to us all known facts, all known fraud, and a variety of other representations. We're not aware of any significant accounting or auditing matters for which management consulted with other accountants. Normally, if there are consultation with other firms about some audit matters, the audit firm is supposed to contact us, or the accounting firm is supposed to contact us to just make sure that they have all the proper information, all the needed information. Other than our engagement letter and the representation letter, we had no other communication with management. There were no material uncertainties relating to events and conditions, and we have not become aware of any instance of fraud or illegal acts. Finally, here on this slide is a listing of all the new accounting standards and their implementation date. As I mentioned earlier, every year we will discuss with management the new accounting standards coming, work with management on determining whether any of them would be applicable to the city, and also work with the city on how to get ready for them and how they can properly implement those standards. With that concludes my presentation. So I want to say thank you for allowing us the opportunity, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Badawi, and I really want to thank you for giving Vice Mayor Christensen and myself kind of a preview of this presentation and understanding where we have some challenges, but also that the majority of what we're doing is really excelling. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Any questions from my colleagues? All right. So I'll go ahead and move forward to any public comment on this topic of audit. So if you have a public comment on this item, please raise your hand, your virtual hand. And if you would like to speak on this item, we can go ahead and call your name. You will look for a pop-up and click where indicated so that you can become promoted to a panelist to provide your comments. Before I get to that public comment, I see that Brigitte Elke has a question or a comment.
Yes, we actually do have some more information for you in regards of the actual financials that are within the report. And then also I would like to address some of those findings. So it's up to you, Madam Mayor, whether you want us to continue or whether you want to hear any public hearing, maybe for questions for Mr. Badawi directly.
Go ahead and continue. I apologize. I was thinking public comment for Mr. Badawi, but I think let's wait till the whole thing is done. Thank you about that.
All right. Thank you very much. And I'll just go back to Mr. Badawi, if you could maybe stop sharing your screen, then I can bring mine back up.
I believe I'm no longer sharing my screen.
Apparently,
I'm sharing mine.
Oh, okay. All righty.
Okay.
So can you see then the slide that says the fiscal year 2020-21 financial statements? So the next slide, please.
I believe we're on the audit highlights.
All right, yeah, I can go over that as well. So as you've heard from Mr. Badawi, we received a unqualified and clean audit. We do have 5 findings, and we will address those later in the presentation. And you will see within the statements that will be presented, we see increases in all our fund balances, which is also a outlook at the dedication and the prudent fiscal management of the City Council with the activation of the fiscal health contingency plan that guided us through these difficult years that are under COVID-19 influences and many uncertainties. And before I hand it over now, I wanted to just quickly thank Mr. Badawi for his ongoing commitment to the city. We really appreciate the collaboration. And now I'm actually handing it over to your accounting manager and controller, Mrs. Debbie Malakode, for a look at the actual financial statements within the annual report.
Good evening, Mayor and members of City Council. Not sure why my slideshow is not advancing here, but we will see if we can't give it a go. Technology is hard tonight.
Debbie, if I could just do a suggestion, maybe to stop sharing for a moment and then resharing, that sometimes gets it to re-trigger.
It didn't want to launch for me before, and now it's really not wanting to launch.
Brigitte, do you
Brigitte, do you happen to have it available?
Yeah, let me see here.
Not sure.
All righty. Can you see the screen that now says fiscal year 2021 financial statements?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful.
All right.
All righty. We're back on track. We'll get this going here with technology.
Well, good evening, Council. Tonight, I just wanted to present a little bit of the information that's contained within the financial statements that you heard about the audit of. And basically, they're broken down into kind of two types of funds. We have governmental funds and we have proprietary funds, which we also sometimes refer to as enterprise funds. The governmental funds are things that include like the general fund, the local sales tax measure fund. These are some of the terms that you've heard of. Also funds that include how we acquire or build capital assets, as well as funds related to special revenue sources. Within the governmental funds during the fiscal year, we had total revenues of almost $105 million. And you can see on this slide that it's broken down into various revenue sources. And as you might expect from governmental funds, a vast majority of the revenue comes from taxing sources like sales tax, property tax, the TOT, which is the hotel motel bed tax. So about 67% of our governmental revenue came from these taxing sources, which is approximately $70 million, just to kind of put that into perspective. Then there's an additional $22 million, which is about 21% of our revenue source that comes from services. These are things such as parks and recreation programs, development review, special assessments that happen. And then approximately 12% of the revenue comes from other various sources. So this does not include the 4 enterprise funds: water, sewer, parking, and transit, but I'll talk about them in a little bit. They largely operate based on user service charges and not so much from tax revenues. On the next slide, you'll see how we spent that $105 million that came in. We didn't actually spend all of it. We only spent about $87 million. And the largest portion, as you might expect, was for public safety. This is the biggest individual segment of our spending, followed by capital outlay. And I'd like to point out that out of the $14 million in capital outlay, about 8.3 million of that came from our local sales tax measure. So it's a significant source of funding for our capital outlay, as well as our operating expenses. So in addition to these $86.9 million of expenses in the governmental funds, remember we also have those 4 enterprise funds. They also spent another $43 million, which I'll show you in just a moment. On the next slide, you'll see that this is the general fund, which is the city's largest operating fund and includes our local sales tax measure. At the end of June 2021, we had about $47.1 million in our fund balance, but not all of that is available for new spending or new appropriations. Much of it is reserved or committed for previous actions by the council. We do have a policy of maintaining a minimum fund balance of 20% of operating expenditures. So you can see that's about $11.8 million to maintain our fund balance policy. The local revenue measure balance that you see there, $9.3 million, most of this is already budgeted. It was just unspent at the end of the fiscal year, and it remains committed to achieving the various mostly capital projects that have already been identified. We also have an insurance fund, which is to provide for future workers' compensation and liabilities. Then there are plans that the council has made. We've assigned expenditures to certain activities. They haven't happened yet, but they're not as policy driven or concrete as the committed balances. So these are things like $4.8 million worth of encumbrances. These are basically purchase orders that were issued and by the end of the year, but they had not been completely fulfilled yet. So we still had some purchases to make. We are setting aside some funding, if you will, for the creation of a Section 115 trust, which will help with our longer term pension obligations. And you'll also see a large assignment there for the CalPERS payment of $10.2 million. This represents voluntary additional payments towards the city's unfunded liability that were part of the city's fiscal health response plan, but they were put on hold when we activated the fiscal health contingency plan with when COVID occurred and we activated that plan. So we are reflecting here that we do intend to continue to make those CalPERS payments that will achieve our goals on the fiscal health response plan of managing our unfunded liability over the long term. This leaves us with about $5.3 million of unassigned fund balance. That's the portion that is potentially available for new spending. That's not something that you'll be discussing tonight. That will be the subject of the upcoming mid-year budget review, which will be on February 15th in the context of the larger economic outlook for the next 6 months of the financial plan. I do want to point out that that meeting is on February 15th and was inadvertently listed as February 16th in our staff report. Focusing just for a minute on the local revenue measure, this is a significant source of funding for both operating and capital programs, as I mentioned earlier. We did bring in about $12.7 million in revenue, and we used about $2.4 million of that in largely staffing costs for positions that support the local revenue measure priorities. We also spent about $8.3 million in capital projects, and we have about $3.9 million remaining in encumbrances and purchase orders that are just unfulfilled at the end of the fiscal year. There's more information available in the financial statements related to the spending on local revenue measure. We are committed to transparency and communicating to the community how we've spent this important funding source. This is located on page 121 of the ACFR. Turning now to our proprietary or enterprise funds, as I mentioned, we have 4 of them. Water, sewer, parking, and transit collectively brought in about $53.2 million in revenues. And you can see these broken down amongst the various funding sources and types of revenues for each fund on your screen. These are presented on page 41 of the financial statements for additional information. The proprietary funds spent about $43 million. And again, you can see the majority of this is on staffing and contract services. We are staffing heavy organization because we are a service organization. The parking fund, transit fund, sewer fund, and water fund collectively spent about $43 million. Again, information available on page 41 of the financial statements for further information. Turning for a quick look at our capital assets, we have approximately $200 million in the governmental fund assets, and the majority of this is in a category we call infrastructure. And that really represents things like roads, bridges, traffic signals, streetlights, sidewalks, park improvements, those types of infrastructure assets that we have as a city represents the biggest majority of our governmental assets, followed by land and public art. And then we also have some buildings, equipment, and various other things under construction. On the other side, the enterprise assets also represent a little over $200 million. And you can see based on this chart that the majority of that is contained in the sewer fund. It represents a significant upgrade at the wharf, which I'm sure you're all aware of. It's not yet complete. So by the time you see this chart again next year, I expect the sewer fund will represent an even bigger piece of the overall pie of our assets. Accompanying the financial statement numbers are the notes section, and these really provide additional analysis, and they should be viewed in concert with the numbers, and the notes give additional information on various topics within the financial statements. We don't have any new notes this year, but we continue to have a COVID-19 related note. And this is the second year with the new note number 4 that reports information about the city's housing related loans. The last section of the ACFR is the statistical section, and it provides 3 types of information. First is financial trends. The second is information regarding our revenue and debt capacity. And the third is demographic, economic, and operating information. These are a great source of information, especially when you're looking for longer term trends. Many of the schedules in the statistical section offer up to 10 years of historic information. And with that, I will hand it back to Director Elke.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Appreciate the presentation. And before we actually turn it back to the City Council for questions, we wanted to address the findings that Mr. Badawi reported on. So we have most certainly improved the system and our processes, what we feel quite exponentially. We have not quite arrived yet. We want to reiterate to the council that we take the findings very seriously and are very committed to continued improvements of our processes, and with that also the city's ERP system. We continue to work with Oracle Consulting and our internal motion team on system configuration and subsequent improvements to the processes within the system. We have instituted additional oversight and control functions to review areas of concerns on a monthly basis. And we're working with Mr. Badawi and his team on potential early check-ins to review areas of improvements and to make sure that they actually meet the auditor's expectations. We are happy to report that the ERP system now has been configured to provide the numbering of journal entries. It went live in the system in December, and staff is currently working on placing the journal entries that came before that switch into a sequence that the auditors then can review and make sure that it actually meets the intent of the finding. Though our bank reconciliation still has obstacles due to payroll costing, the system is now at least assisting us with the effort, and we have instituted monthly review meetings to address potential discrepancies early on and make sure that we can reconcile every month going forward. And we are turning also to improvements of our year-end checklists to address closing deficiencies and conduct month-end closings and subsequent review of any open issues that come through that process. The payroll and human capital management module configurations are ongoing, and we continue to improve the system's performance on that area to eliminate a lot of these manual adjustments that are still needed step by step. And we hope every single year we can improve that and eliminate these type of issues from a control functions, but also from a staffing demand function. And lastly, together with your revenue team, we're actually beginning audits of each cashiering system and also the cash handling at the various city locations that do actually take in revenue, which all of this effort includes audits of the applicable controls on the daily deposits that then come to city finance for reconciliation. We are confident that the 2021-22 audit will show further improvements and hopefully facilitate the year end as well as the audit effort for both the city's internal team as well as for the auditors. And with that, I wanted to mention that we also have published a popular annual financial report that takes the information within the annual comprehensive financial report and kind of distills it down into a more, I want to say, attractive way to reading the financial statements. The ACFR in itself is very prescribed in regards of the information contained within, and the popular annual financial report allows us a little bit more flexibility and the creative use of information. And it has been posted on the city's website. We're also looking to potentially engage with GFOA. They have a program that will partner us with a graduate student to review the popular annual financial report so we could submit it for the award program for GFOA. And with that, I'll turn it back to the City Council for any questions, either for city staff or Mr. Badawi, and bring back the recommendation before you tonight.
Thank you so much, and really appreciate the link there to the more distilled version that the average person in the community may want to read this. Council Member Pease.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Ms. Elke, for the follow-up on the findings and the next steps. And you know, each time we do this, it does seem that there's always some findings, and that there's it seems like there's a lot of software issues, but there's progress each time as well. And so, and I'm wondering if you can, like, when you were going into the 2021 audit in terms of findings, were you already aware of what would likely to be the findings? And then kind of projecting forward, do you see like, well, 21, 22, we're trying to address this and such, but we know we might not quite be able to make it? You know what I'm asking in terms of what you're seeing yourselves before the audit even happens versus kind of new information that the auditor is providing.
Yes, absolutely. So we do obviously base our work on the findings and look at process and system improvements accordingly. So with that, we had concentrated this year on the journal entry and the sequencing of those journal entries. So hopefully when we now present this to Mr. Badawi and his team, he can give us feedback whether this actually comes through on the intent and what they were looking for. But it has actually now put into the system not only the sequencing, but the flow of the journal entry, and with that, the internal control who enters it, who reviews it, and who ultimately posts it. And depending on the value of the journal entry, it might go to Mrs. Malakote for ultimate approval, or it might even come to me for ultimate approval, depending who actually initiates it and who then ultimately needs to post it. And as it pertains to the other finding on bank reconciliation, again, we take the finding, we look at improvements and how we can actually review it and make sure that we hold pace with every month and make sure we address any discrepancies. And I was able to discuss this with Mr. Badawi, and we might actually, within the March-April timeframe, send to his team several months of reconciliation to make sure, yes, we're now on track. Yes, it is now coming through on the findings and correcting these deficiencies that we had. Again, we are able for the system to now help us with that. So a large number of the thousands and thousands of transactions are now actually matched up by the system, which allows the internal city team to concentrate on the ones that might be a little bit off from the two systems and can actually review them and correct them. So we hope we can actually improve exponentially this year, again, because with every month we see progress within the system, we see progress within our internal controls and how we review those areas that we need to improve. And then hopefully once the auditor's team was able to review and give us feedback, we know a little bit better what we might still be struggling with. We really hope to get away from quite a few of the findings that were put forth, but it is a continued progress. And as I mentioned to our team, what we're concentrating on is really the commitment to improve and to make sure that with every single year, we can address it and get better at it. Will we fully arrive at the end of this fiscal year? Fingers crossed, but we will see. We hope that a lot of the findings currently presented to you will be a non-issue going forward, and we can continue with timely reconciliations, review of our efforts, and make this an easy audit and a timely audit for both Mr. Badawi and his team, as well as for the city's internal team and management.
Great, thank you. And sounds like a really collaborative team effort for all of that, and much appreciated. I can't imagine how complicated all of that is, and then transitioning the systems, etc. And then my second question, not about the audit, but about the financials overall, and if the CalPERS and the discount rate, and I'm wondering if, so it looked like CalPERS had a 21% investment gain, and then the discount rate went down to 6.8%. And I assume we'll hear, more about the impacts of that at a February meeting, but I'm wondering if you can shed a little bit of light. I know it had been 7.5%, it went down to 7%, and so there was a lot of adjusting. And so what's happening at CalPERS? What's our looking back, looking forward for that process and the impacts on the city?
Yeah, happy to address. Yes, the 21.3% return actually triggered the activation of the CalPERS risk mitigation policy that was enacted, I believe, back in 2013 or 15. It basically set forth that as CalPERS reduced from 7.5% to 7%, they knew that 7% was probably a bit too optimistic in the long run, but they didn't want to continue any reduction unless they had really high returns that would allow them to lower the overall assumption going forward, but then work with these gains to offset some of the impacts that might have. for all the employers, about 3,000 employers that partake in CalPERS. Unfortunately, we do not know the effects of the 21.3% rate when it happens. It usually lags a year behind, but the CalPERS staff has actually implemented some tools that we can use where we can go in and calculate the immediate impact of that return, as well as impacts of any additional payments that we would make to CalPERS to hold with that original intent to deal with the unfunded liability over a 20-year time horizon instead of the 30 years that really CalPERS set forth. I would like to reiterate that this is an internal decision to look at a 20-year horizon. The city did not commit to fresh start, the 20-year option with CalPERS, because once you commit to fresh start in the 20 years, that's it. You really are tied into that 20-year horizon. So we really, with the fiscal health response plan, and the action taken and the concessions made by employees, we internally committed to paying this unfunded liability down as quickly as possible. But with those systems that we now have available, we can actually look at what our funding ratio is. And so with the 21.3%, the city's funding ratio would come up to about 70% in both the miscellaneous and the safety plan. And if we made the $10.2 million payment, as we had actually looked at, 3 years basically of payments that we had originally intended, and we would make those payments, and $10.2 million, I would like to clarify, is the general fund portion. So there's an enterprise fund portion that would come with it. So closer to $11.5 million all combined, we would come up to about 75% of funding at current levels.
All right, thank you for clarifying that. It sounds like they needed to be lowering it and we're waiting for a good return in order to be able to, without the same kinds of impact. So that definitely had not been clear. So I appreciate that.
Right, yeah.
And the payment information as far as around 70%. Those were my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Pease. Great questions. Any other questions for Ms. Elke or Malcote? Okay. Now we'll move forward to public comment. In case there's anyone online that would like to ask any questions of either our financial staff or the auditing questions, please feel free to raise your hand at this time. And before I go into the spiel, I'll just ask City Clerk if there are any hands raised.
No, there are not.
Okay, so can I move forward and have a motion to review or to accept the annual comprehensive financial report? Councilmember Shoresman.
I will make a motion to approve the annual comprehensive financial report.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Christensen.
I will second it, and I do appreciate the advanced presentations we got from Mr. Badawi, and then today I had agenda review too. So by the time you hear it the second or third time, it's really in there. Appreciate all the work done.
Very true, and switching software is never easy, and for a large organization such as ours with the many different line items, I can only imagine what it's like going through this project. So thank you very much for all of your hard work to the whole accounting team. All right, City Clerk, you're welcome. City Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Shoresman?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Christensen?
Yes.
Councilmember Marks?
Yes.
Councilmember Pease?
Yes.
Mayor Stewart?
Yes. The motion was passed 5-0. Thank you very much for your time. And we are going to go ahead and take a quick break. It's 7:47. And so we'll go ahead and come back at 8 o'clock even. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we are ready to call the meeting back to order. We are ready to discuss we are ready to discuss the release of a request for proposals for the access and parking management plan update. And I think I saw, yep, everyone's online. Would staff like to present the report?
All right, thank you, Madam Mayor. Members of Council, I'm Matt Horn, the Public Works Director for the city. Tonight, we have for Council's consideration a request to update the Access and Parking Management Plan, which serves as a guiding document for the city's parking program. The plan is intended to provide guidance and direction to move forward in a holistic approach for parking and parking's interface to mobility in San Luis Obispo. Alex, would you advance to the next slide, please? So tonight, for Council's consideration, staff is seeking authorization to advertise a request for proposal for consultant service work to provide direction to staff on any necessary scope of work changes or augmentations, both in the scope of the RFP, but even the outreach component of it as well, and to appropriate $100,000 to fund consultant service cost and authorize the city manager to enter into agreement with the selected consultant. So tonight we have both Gavin Hussey, the parking program manager, and Alex Fuchs, our parking services supervisor, to present the report. And with that, I will hand it off to Gavin. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Good evening, council members and Madam Mayor. Matt kind of stole my thunder there and outlined a lot of stuff I was going to cover. So I'm appreciative to that. And it is a lot, and I'm pretty sure everyone's excited to be a parking professional. So let's get into it. What is a parking and access management plan? The Access and Parking Management Plan provides the framework and core values that parking services applies to meet the city's goals and objectives. The plan aligns the vision policies with other city documents, as well as identifies current, near-term, and long-term strategies for a holistic approach to managing public parking system. A major goal of the plan is to improve access and parking for our community as a whole. The current Access and Parking Management Plan was initially created in 1995 and has been updated to include parking management strategies which reduce employee trips to downtown, improve bicycle access, and encourage parking turnover. Unfortunately, the existing plan has seen limited updates over the last 2 decades and is currently out of alignment with industry standards and other city documents. The plan should receive basic updates every 3 to 5 years, or when supporting documents are revised. The plan should see a full review at least every 10 years, like we're requesting tonight. Since the most recent update, the city has adopted the Downtown Concept Plan, the Active Transportation Plan, the Climate Action Plan, new zoning regulations, the Short Range Transit Plan, and the General Plan. There have been many changes at the state and federal level that have impacted our parking in our community. Adjustments to the pandemic, which includes support of local businesses, the downtown repaving projects, and the downtown repaving projects begin to showcase where our community is heading. The plan is intended to help address some of the impacts like these and shape the future of parking in our community. Next slide. So where we're at, parking service is in the process of modernizing. Why you might ask? Well, up until last year, we were using much of the same technologies that were implemented with the first parking meter in the 1930s, or had been developed in the 1980s with advancements to the computer. For reference, our city was the last in the county of SLO that has a parking program to implement multi-space parking stations. I would like to highlight that we are a leader with the launch of our mobile apps. We recently launched 4 mobile parking applications that allow customers to park and extend their parking sessions. This will allow us to remotely move towards tiered-based parking and do away with time limits. Many of the current strategies we're implementing to update the division and improve convenience and customer service and address commercial districts are not addressed at the current parking and access management plan, and will help guide our division's policy when they are updated. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alex for the completion of the presentation.
Thank you, Gavin. So some of the major goals of the plan update is to ensure that the parking fund stays fiscally solvent in order to support the construction of new facilities, to bring together city goals and objectives from other previously approved plans like Gavin had mentioned, to support the needs of the downtown area as well as preferential parking districts throughout the city, to provide strategies to address mixed use areas where commercial and residential meet, and to provide policies for reducing parking demand through various programs. Outlined on this slide is the proposed scope of work contained within the Access Parking Management Plan Update RFP. There is a major emphasis on public outreach with stakeholders, including City Council, Downtown SLO, Chamber of Commerce, resident groups, and Cal Poly, to name a few. Staff intends for this document to provide clear goals, policies, and strategies that the city can lean on to help guide decisions as we continue to build our parking future. This proposed scope of work is by no means final, and staff is seeking feedback from council tonight as to what they would like to see included in the plan's update, but more to follow on that shortly. The tentative timeline outlined in this RFP is aggressive and will likely be adjusted based on consultant recommendations on the process to conduct a thorough assessment. Council will be informed, however, of the schedule once it is finalized. Staff's goal is to use the updated and finalized plan to help inform and shape the parking fund analysis for the 23-25 financial plan. So once again, the recommendations are to provide staff with direction on the scope of work to be included in the plan update RFP, authorize the issuance of an RFP for update to the parking access management plan, to allocate $100,000 from the parking fund to the parking programs contract services account, and to authorize the city manager to execute an agreement with a selected consultant for up to the project budget. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, staff is seeking input from council tonight on the proposed scope of work. This slide before you includes several questions for council to consider and to help start the discussion about which elements and to what extent they should be included in the scope. For navigation purposes, the complete detailed scope of work can be found on packet pages 538 through 540. And with that, staff will turn it over to council for questions, comments, and anything related to the plan update scope of work.
Thank you so much. That was a much quicker presentation for all the information that's in the packet, but thank you, I'm amazed. Are there any questions from my colleagues? I am not seeing any. And so, oh, wait, just kidding. Hold on.
Yeah.
City clerk, I see there's raised hands. Can you help me out for a second?
I think
Councilmember
Pease went first. Yeah.
Thank you. My mouse was stuck. Thank you so much, Councilmember Pease.
All right. Thank you so much. And I have kind of comments when we get to deliberation, but I wanted to start with a couple of questions. First, this is a super basic one. Seems like there's a lot of parking management plans out there. Ours is parking and access. What's the access part, and do we need that, or can we just have it be a parking management plan?
So our intent with that was to create a larger focused holistic approach to parking and accessing downtown. We do have programs that spill over into other facets of community, and we wanted to make sure that that was touched on, especially mobility through our community.
So access to me means a bunch of different things. So I guess I'm not sure what part. Can you just be a little bit, maybe give me an example of what you mean by access that wouldn't be covered in a parking plan. I just want to make sure we're not throwing such a big net that there's either unrealistic expectations or maybe that there's more to this than I'm seeing.
Yeah, so we want to make sure that, people are able to, we provide the appropriate programs that people are able to utilize to come into our community, whether that's using a bus to get in here, or driving, or using an alternate means of transportation. So that's our intent with access.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, just to provide an example. One example might be curb management, where we do pickup and loading zones. And so not parking per se, but it's curbside management. And and so we have that term that's used, and as the council's well aware, as we've seen the rise of rideshare, Uber and Lyft, and compounded the challenges with parklets. Part of it, we want to make sure we're looking at it as well. So it's a little bit about access, not necessarily the act of parking per se.
Great, thank you, that's helpful. And then in terms of parking management plans or parking and access management plans, do you have, I could certainly look through the 2002 from the city, which we've all kind of agreed is outdated. And then I've seen some other cities with parking management plans. Often they're targeted for like a downtown core, et cetera. Are there like example cities, and you don't have to pull them out right now, but have you seen some great plans that are kind of a little bit more aspirational, future looking, forward thinking, that you think that this process will be able to kind of result in that kind of product? Is that out there already?
I do believe that is there. Sacramento is a good example. They have a pretty detailed plan. I do say that we are planning to have the consultant provide some of this information for us with regard to best practices that other municipalities are using.
Great, thanks. And then my last of the questions, I think, is the, and you kind of allude to that when we're talking about relying on the consultant. In the process, do we have a vetting or a scoring process? I didn't see that particularly, so that we can make sure that we get the right firm as we do, through the RFP process, that we get somebody who's, in the right fee and responsiveness, but also do we need to add more language or in order to really get the best ones to be able to help us meet our vision?
Yes, so staff is working on the scoring form and the criteria that is necessary to identify the leader in the industry.
Okay, terrific. So my questions, thanks.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Schwarzman.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions, I guess, about what you foresee as staff in the process while you're selecting the process of the RFP. It mentions in the RFP an ad hoc committee that would be part of the planning process, but it doesn't say how often your expectation was that this planning or this ad hoc committee would meet. And so I was just curious if you had sort of a theory around that, or if you were just going to wait for proposals from folks that were applying and see what they thought would be appropriate.
Yep. So thank you for the question. We are looking at the timeline now and assessing whether an ad hoc committee will be beneficial for the timeline that we've set forth. It's a very aggressive timeline. We are trying to get this plan back so we can make decisions with the 23-24 financial plan. So with trying to develop an ad hoc committee and get them set up might not be a realistic goal. We are going to have the consultant provide some direction on what they think is necessary for community outreach with regard to different community partners and how many times they plan to address each community group that we've outlined.
Okay, and then I also see in the RFP note of, surveys and sort of the public engagement activities that would be your expectations. And I notably absent from those are sort of the public town hall type or dot meeting style. I'm wondering you didn't include those because you're concerned that those are a thing of the past because of COVID, or if that just is not really on your radar right now.
No.
And if so, what would you substitute it with?
Yeah, no, not at all. We do plan to do public engagements. I think that transportation's done it pretty well. Luke Schwartz and his team have done a bunch of community outreaches in recent months, trying to gauge community engagement through virtual formats. So I think our intent with the consultant would be to set up some of these virtual town halls for people to voice their opinion on parking across the community.
Okay, and last, sort of to throw one of your questions back here that's on the screen back at you a little bit. There's a lot of public engagement, advisory body engagement, which I think is all great. I love that you've included the Active Transportation Committee and the Planning Commission and the council, and plan to sort of get feedback or do presentations before all those. But your questions here ask how often the council would like to be involved in the process. And so again, given the short, aggressive timeline, what would be your recommendation in the timing of those presentations or visits to council, and how many would you recommend?
Yep. So at a minimum, too, I do think it's a benefit for council to meet up front with the consultant, kind of outline some of your aspirations, hopes, and dreams, and then to meet at the tail end after everyone else has had their chance to outline their expectations of what they see parking being in our community.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll have some more thoughts when we deliberate later.
Thank you, Councilmember Marks.
Thank you. Yes, well, I have to say that I'm a veteran of both the 2002 and the 2011 plans, that they definitely need to be updated. My questions are, well, first of all, how will this expenditure of $100,000 from the parking fund affect the funding of the Palm to Pomo parking structure?
Let's unmute myself. So it's a nominal fee. We don't believe that it'll affect the funding for the Palm and Pomo parking structure. We do have enough in our working capital to cover this expense.
Okay, so do you think it will improve the ability to fund the Pomo parking structure?
Yes, in our long-range vision for it, and the plan will help assess where parking needs to go and provide us the structure that we need. And I do think that a lot of that dovetails into how we get there with new parking structures and new acquisitions for parking. I'm sure that the parking structure we're working on will not be the last thing that the city builds, and we do have to plan for that. And part of that's going to be building the fund up, and this will provide the structure for it.
Okay, so I'm curious if you imagine reaching out to various partners like Cal Poly and the county and various developers in terms of getting some help along the way in terms of financing the parking situation, which is exacerbated by a lot of what those entities have done. And I'll just speak about the county. Like, they never provided enough parking for their employees that they bring to the government center. They didn't do it. We tried. I mean, they're a superior agency, so we tried back in the day to get them to provide parking as well, for their employees. They have it underground parking for the supervisors and the higher level, but is that included in your idea of what the consultant should look at?
So partnering with them to provide parking and receive funding, that is not something that we've outlined in the plan. I will say that our vision for parking in the future for downtown San Luis Obispo does incorporate ways to assist the county and provide parking for them at off-site locations. And that's something we are working towards. this plan will probably help guide some of the policy decisions that we wind up making around that, and provide programs that would be beneficial for the county and other businesses throughout the area.
Okay, thank you. And I wonder if the consultant is going to look at the effect of removing curbside parking from residential areas.
So that's not part of the scope we've asked them to look at. We are asking them to review residential parking districts and commercial parking districts. They'll decide, they'll at least give us some structure and guidance as to the programs that we have in place, if they're effective and should continue, or if we should adjust them to match other industry standards.
And are you considering ADA and disability parking requirements in terms of the scope of what you're looking at?
Yes, that is one of the focuses that we are asking them to take a look at.
Okay. And then this is really not related to your plan exactly, but what parking app would be best for local people who mostly park in the city of San Luis Obispo? I'm being told there are all these different apps. I think, okay, I will download one. What do you think? What would you tell the general public? Like, if you mostly just park in the city of San Luis Obispo, which of these many apps would be best in your opinion?
So I can't advocate for one or the other. It creates an unfair condition for them to play by. I will say that each app has different levels of interface. I would advise all of our customers, if you don't already have one of the apps we have, to investigate and take a look at them, because each one of them does have a benefit for their specific customers.
Okay, I was thinking more of just coverage for the city of San Luis Obispo. So do all of these apps cover the whole city?
Yeah, yes, all four do cover the whole city, all of our
Okay.
paid parking.
Thank you. All right, that's all my questions. Thanks a lot.
And Madam Mayor, before we jump into some next questions, I just wanted to maybe provide a little bit of follow-up. I think fundamentally, it relates to Cal Poly. I think that there are, of course, we're all aware of the master plan and for campus, and a lot of the new projects will rely upon building on existing surface parking lots. And so as those surface parking lots are built over, we have to plan for and anticipate what is going to be the parking in some of the neighborhoods. And we're already seeing that project farther into the city than I think we had seen in years past. And we know that the university's EIR counted on and indicated there would be a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions likely from transit. So I think that's the piece of that we need to collaborate with Cal Poly, is how are we going to manage that spillover parking into some of the surrounding neighborhoods. And I think we need to be prepared to probably look beyond just the adjacent neighborhoods and look farther out. With respect to the county, I have had the pleasure of working in 3 counties, and I would say and they've all been in the county seat, and every county, I would say, doesn't have the adequate parking, nor I think would we want from an urban form just to have parking for the hundreds, if not some cases like Santa Barbara County, over 1,000 employees in the downtown. You'd have large buildings and blocks that would be devoted to warehousing vehicles. And so there is a natural kind of tension there, I think, between cities and counties as a result of that dynamic, and one that we're acutely aware of. And I think we'll have to have conversations, because if we follow the trends in other jurisdictions, particularly my experience down in Santa Barbara, eventually the neighborhoods got fatigued with the employees parking in front of their homes for extended periods, and it created kind of a rub. And I think we want to address that dynamic. Gavin, maybe you can answer the question for Councilmember Marks about what is the app that is used on campus. And so if you're a frequent Cal Poly visitor or visitor and using parking in town, what is that apps that would just maximize your local utility of an app?
Yep. So Park Mobile is the app that's used at Cal Poly. And if you are coming up from the 5 cities, Pismo Beach uses Park Smarter.
Great. Thank you, Madam Mayor, for the opportunity just to expand on some of the answers.
You're welcome. Thank you. And can you also, share about the Monterey and Santa Rosa parking garage? Is that something that has moved forward or on pause, or what's the next steps?
Yep. So the the Midtown parking structure, I believe that's on pause from the county's end. The city has opted not to pursue entering into that. If the structure does move forward, there is a chance that we might be able to operate it for them, but we are not going to be able to be financially solvable and contribute to that.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Marks, did you have additional questions? All right, you're on mute, but I assume that's a no.
Oh, sorry, no more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Pease.
Thanks. I have one more question, which is in the scope of work, it talks about perform a parking survey, provide recommendations, and it seems a viable sample size representative of key stakeholders. And so I'm wondering if you could just clarify what the expectation is, what's realistic in terms of an actual statistically valid survey of people versus a kind of a survey assessment of where cars are parking and what percent complete, and versus a kind of general assessment that's not necessarily valid in terms of, it's information, but in terms of different user groups. What's the thinking there?
Yeah, so our hope is, or our expectation with the consultant is that they are going to rely on us to provide them community partners that help influence our activity downtown and around the community. We've seen most recently with us working towards creating a commercial parking district. We have community members in outlying areas that need assistance. These are all people that we want to help and make sure that are represented in the survey. This includes other various groups like Cal Poly and Cuesta, who also influence activity in our community. So our goal is that they will reach out to these organizations and these individuals. That should provide the majority of framework in addition to our residential community that also provide a huge portion of influence for parking. Beyond that, we're going to use some of the information that we have accumulated in parking over the last few years regarding occupancy and so forth to help drive their decision making.
Great, thanks. So it's not like a blind phone survey, that type of thing. It's more strategic. Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, we have specific groups that we want them to talk to help guide the decision. I think the open format, the virtual format that we will use should also help provide some of the community members a chance to speak.
Thanks.
Thank you. So many of my questions are answered by or already asked, so I'll keep it short. As far as when we talk about community outreach, I feel like I heard a lot, but still kind of missing how will we connect with people who are in, maybe low income spaces that are trying to, they're maybe not going to be in some of these key spaces you're mentioning as far as being able to put in feedback, but yet would probably be the people who would be most affected.
No, definitely understand that. Our intent would be to allow them a means, whether that's writing in an email or dropping off a letter to us to provide their input. Our hope would be that we could provide enough information on our website that people could provide those inquiries to us. If not, we could consider doing a mailing to the community also.
And Madam Mayor, if I could hop in, we saw some pretty creative examples, and we'll be looking at in the RFP, whether it's pop-ups at meetings, going to, faith groups, whether it's going to groups, whether it's focus groups with leaders from those groups. I think there's, that's what we'll be looking for is how are they proposing to reach those groups? That's why we've not stepped into the specific tactics, but we'll be evaluating that. And I've asked Gavin and Alex to provide some indication about how we're going to be scoring and ranking based upon, those various aspects, including their ability to reach, hard populations.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. I know there's open town hall and all sorts of great ways that we can reach out, and want to make sure we can help out in whatever ways possible. And then last question, as we had that legislative briefing earlier, talking about the electric vehicle charging stations, it seems as though we're needing to clear out spaces in parking for electric parking. Will we be giving instructions to the contractors for the RFP to understand that that has to be part of the process, or is that something you do after the study's been done?
Follow you there. Part of the instructions with all these processes are that they follow state and local guidelines in addition to federal guidelines when they're doing this. So that is something that they're going to take a look at while they're going through the process.
Great, thank you so much. All right, any other questions from my colleagues? Okay, we'll move forward and see if anyone on the attendee list would like to respond in public comment or make a comment. If so, please raise your virtual hand now and we'll move you forward. All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and start with council deliberations. Any questions or thoughts, Councilmember Pease?
Sure, I'll jump in and start because this is one of my favorite activities that we're taking on this year. I'm just really looking forward to it, and it's going to be a challenge. I mean, I think what I feel like I have in my own mind. I want this to be able to at least move us towards that paradigm shift where I think that there's still a lot of old school folks who are going to be wanting a lot of parking and low cost or free parking, and that's just the paradigm shift that we need to see. It's not equitable, that kind of parking access. It's not in alignment with our climate action goals, and it's not good land use planning, right, for a city like ours that's trying to infill and not sprawl and keep our open space, et cetera. So I think that there's that this is really an important study. In a lot of ways, I feel like we have a pretty good path on the downtown in terms of the direction that we're going there, and the curb management and the time of use tiers and all those types of things. I feel like a lot of the parts where I feel lost is more about outside of downtown. So both the neighborhood districts, but also like, what do we do around Foothill and Santa Rosa and Choro, and where we have these commercial areas that are just right there at residential areas and multifamily housing, and so I feel like those are some of the real challenge areas for us from a parking perspective. And so to be able to get kind of the utilization and have just some clarity of like, here's our values and mission, and so that therefore that informs the policy, which I know you're in alignment with. So I'm good with that. So I do think that we should have emphasis on, perhaps it's a balance between downtown and the rest of the city, et cetera, depending on how much input that staff feels like they need about downtown. But for me, I feel more the need for the rest of the city as far as that goes. The public outreach that you're talking about sounds appropriate if kind of that targeted type of groups, rather than necessarily an ad hoc, because it would be a challenge to get all those opinions, and then what feedback are they really getting into. So anyway, I'm open to that either way. Let's see, I think we've talked about kind of these case studies and new best practices. And yeah, I think those are the main things that I'm really focused on is kind of that management of the future, and how do we focus on vehicle miles, reducing vehicle miles traveled and emissions, and think about equity and some of those bigger deals while we still support our residents and our businesses who have folks from out of town and folks who still need to drive, and ADA access, etc. So a little rambly, but hopefully get the idea.
Thank you, Councilmember Shorsman. You're muted.
It's killing me tonight. Okay, I do appreciate, once again, I echo a lot of what Councilmember Pease said before me, but I think there's a couple, just in looking through the RFP, there's a couple somewhat specific suggestions that I might make. Some of them relate to equity and access, as we've already been discussing a little bit. But if we are going to have an ad hoc committee, one suggestion that I might add for the ad hoc committee was to have a representative from Cal Poly maybe, or from a student group. I know that sometimes students are difficult to pin down on commitments like this because they're very busy people and are pulled in lots of directions. But if not a student, then maybe somebody who could represent the interests of Cal Poly in a student's place. Also wonder if we can add some language somewhere about looking for diversity within that group. I think if we make a lot of efforts to get diverse perspectives from the community outreach aspects, that would be, that might substitute instead of an ad hoc committee, if we're able to get racial, ethnic, ability, diversity into the mix of the discussion. That would be great. And I'm not sure how to add that into the RFP, but I would suggest that maybe we put a bullet somewhere about trying to get towards diverse representation of opinion. Also, just a detailed thing, I noticed that the two timelines that are mentioned in the RFP are a little bit off from each other. There's one on page 538 and one on page 546 that staff might look at and try to make those. One of them sounds like the outreach would begin in March, and the other one says the contract wouldn't be completed until April. So probably just a detail thing that you might want to look at. I would agree with Councilmember Pease. I'd like to see it, although I recognize that probably a majority of the issues and a majority of the focus would be on downtown for this plan. I would like to, if it's possible, see a focus on some of the other areas and have this plan be very forward thinking. You look at the 2011 plan now and you can see how outdated some of it is in just 11 years. But I think if we can try to be as forward looking as we can on some of the other areas of the city, Councilmember Pease mentioned the Foothill Toro area, but also possibly Broad and Tank Farm. There's going to be a lot of development in that area in the coming years. So maybe thinking about some of the other areas in our community that might become more populated or more commercially busy in the next several years. I agree with staff's recommendation on probably coming to council twice, as long as we can fit that in. I like the idea of hearing what some of the results of the surveys and public outreach are, but then also having a chance to weigh in before the end. And in terms of surface parking, again, agree with Councilmember Pease. I think we should be moving away from surface parking. It's not a good use of our resources, and any parking changes that we do should probably be focused on structures and access, parking for those with access and functional needs and the elderly, and I'm always a big advocate for getting anybody who can to be walking and biking and taking public transportation. It's good for your health and good for your body and your soul, and also good for the environment. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Christensen.
Yes, thank you. And I remember my very first meeting with Councilmember Pease. She said, "When are we going to talk about parking?" we just finished doing a parking survey and done all this stuff with the 3 parking garages. And as I said, oh, not for a long time. So here we are. It's been a few years. So I have a slightly different take, kind of a more of an adjunct of the comments that have been made already. I think the fact is, and I think we all recognize this, that that we are in a transitional time, and we're probably going to be in a transitional time for our lifetimes. But so we have this mix of wanting to be aspirational and really move the community into what our climate action plan and our housing plans and everything else talk about in terms of not needing so much car parking. And then the reality of it, which is that we have, first of all, lots of communities that do need to drive individual cars. They cannot use other forms of transportation or walk or bike, that kind of thing, whether they're seniors or disabled, or the buses aren't working as well as they should, or whatever. And the fact that lots of people just talk about it, talk a good talk, but don't do the walk. So they're still driving their cars. And that includes not only students, Cal Poly students in the neighborhood surrounding, but it does include the downtown and people who park in the neighborhood surrounding there. And then the workers, whether they're working, wherever they're working and wherever they're parking. And you can talk about any area where there's businesses collected along South Higuera or whatever, and there's going to be infiltration into the neighborhood. So I think the comments that the council has made and that Derek made earlier about really needing to look at parking in a more comprehensive citywide look is going to be really key in terms of an actual forward-thinking document. It's just going to have to recognize that as we fill up parking elsewhere, and as we fill in parking lots, that we're going to be pushing people who don't want to change modes into these other areas, and we need to have a strategy for dealing with that. I also I think it's very important. I guess I've already mentioned it. My organizations would be students, workers, low-income people, elderly, disabled people who would have a difficult time moving to multimodal for whatever reason. And those folks are going to be needing parking. Maybe tourists, visiting the downtown, so those are the people I want to hear from. I really, what I'm concerned about is we're going to get a whole lot of input that says, here's what I need to park. I want parking, free in front of my place of work, in front of my building, whatever. Duh, we all would love that. That's not helpful. I want to have directed parking input. I want to hear, like we kind of do with the budget discussion, here are the different options that we're thinking of. Which one, do you like? Because if you just say, hey, whatever you want, you get 40 different billion answers. I want to know, if we're cutting down parking things and if we're changing, to multimodal, which adaptation can you live with, the best, and make people, talk about that a little bit. Because, and then also talk about when and where they really need individual parking, how much they'd pay for it, what are the barriers to paying for things. I mean, if you have no money and you have a car and you're driving, you can't pay a fortune for your parking. So what do we need? We need better mass transit, or do we need low-income parking support, or whatever? I mean, I just think we need to be really cognizant of that. This is actually not a typical community thing. It's we know where the real problem, we think we know, or we're going to find out where the real problems are. And I want to hear real answers, real ideas from our consultants about best practices and best ways to address it, and I want to hear from the public. Well, of all those ways, which ones do you like best? So that's the kind of, I really want to have, I don't know what the word would be. It isn't directed public input, but it's corralled public input, not just public input. Let's see here. At what waypoints does council want to be involved in the process? I like to be involved when you guys want me to make a decision, as everybody knows. So if there's something that you really think that it's really important for us to have a check-in so we can say something, then that's when I want to hear about this. I don't really want to hear about how everybody's doing and what's going on. I just want, you can tell us about that, or we can ask you. But if you have a important place where it's going like that into a why, and you want to at least hear our input, even if everything else might disagree with our input, that's when I'd want to hear from you. The plan should include triggers for construction and additional parking. Yeah, it should include triggers, but how many more surface parking lot facilities are we going to build? And not if our land use stays as expensive it is, we're not going to build any. And additional parking structures, as we know, cost a fortune. So again, I'm looking to these consultants to give us best practices that hopefully don't include, hey, just build incredibly expensive parking structures or spread out and, build Costco parking lots. That's not an answer in terms of being aspirational or future oriented. So anyway, that's not very important to me. And then implementation timeline, I think 5 years, and I think 5 years for a very specific reason, and that is our students are on 5-year schedules, more or less, maybe 4 years for some of them, maybe 6 years for some of them, but it takes about 5 years to make a significant impact on cat poly behavior, because you have to just keep getting every new class. And we've done that with many other things and parties and everything else. So if we're going to do anything significant in terms of that population, 5 years would be the implementation timeline. 10 years is too long, as we already noted. 2011 is way out of date. So 10 years is going to be way too long, and 3 years isn't long enough. I think that's it on all these questions. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Councilmember Marks.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I agree with much of what Council Vice Mayor Christensen said. I do want to back up a little bit in terms of the controversies that were going on back in 2002. There was a lot of opposition to parking structures because they were considered car magnets. That in some way, if you build a parking structure, you build it, they will come, sort of thing. I've always been a fan and a supporter for the idea of parking structures around the periphery of the downtown. And I think that philosophy has worked out really well, and I'd like to see that keep up. I will say though that we need to look at the car magnets, the county, Cal Poly, Cuesta, and the tourists. That's a huge deal, the tourists. If you look at the the data about who it is who actually comes to San Luis Obispo, basically it's people driving here from San Francisco, Los Angeles, and the Central Valley. There are, of course, other tourists coming, but I'm talking about the tourists who drive here, and we need to consider parking in terms of that group. And maybe the TBID could also, at some point, consider supporting parking that would accommodate the tourists. This is a very vague concept, and I'm not coming up with any particular ideas, but I think people need to take responsibility. Groups need to take responsibility. The other thing is, yes, we need to look at parking outside of the downtown. we need to look at the effect of the removal of parking in residential areas. And I'm specifically relating, the controversy and the considerable angst that still is in the community of residents who are losing curbside parking because of the at-home bike path, okay? But also other sort of situations where you're saying that active transportation, I'm a big supporter of that. But when it starts removing curbside parking from established residential neighborhoods who often have senior citizens living there, we need to really look at that. And I would like to see that kind of included in the RFP so that we're taking a holistic attitude toward the whole city, also recognizing that the development of the city is heading south at this point, and it will continue that way. And so what about looking at projected developments that are just in the process of coming into being, and what is the effect of those concentrations of people on parking? And so I hope that it's not, that we don't pretend that we live in a bubble or an island, that only the people, where we're only accommodating businesses and residents of the city. No, it's a much bigger deal. This city is very attractive and it's going to draw people from all over. So we need to look at that. In terms of, I just want to say, as someone who's in that demographic of senior citizen, we need to really consider older people, disabled people, ADA people, and yes, low income people in terms of how the whole thing is structured. And again, these are just raising issues. I don't have many answers, but I would expect that the the consultant would be able to have a wider grasp of what the city is actually dealing with, and not pursuing any particular ideological philosophy, but looking at really the reality of what we all deal with every day. So thank you. That's all I have to say on this.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely think that the outreach has to be holistic. I think there's, of course, our obvious, Downtown Slow and their parking committee, and we're being on the Downtown Slow board, and the amount of businesses who really needed the Palm de Pomo garage, and now we're finally breaking ground. That was 18 years ago now. So I think there are definitely some things that kind of have been, I guess, kind of feels like it was ignored that now we're finally dealing with. So I think as we look at the future, what does that look like? What are those things that might feel like they're being ignored from the community? Of course, our, like you already have said, the ATC and Cal Poly, and I agree with my council member colleagues around the TBID or Visit SoCal and the tourists, because I don't know the latest numbers, but I remember there were quite a few people. That's the road trip aspect was how we come into their vacation. So if we don't want to encourage that, how will that affect our tourism and our business? So that's going to be, I think, important to find out. I think workers who are in hospitality or tourism are probably, or tourism businesses are probably very directly affected. When you have someone who works till 10 or midnight at a restaurant and our buses close at 7, that doesn't work for them to ride on the bus. And then it's dark at night, they're not necessarily wanting to ride a bike or walk. So how do we find that balance for workers in the community, or workers who come in to, before COVID, we had 30,000 vehicles that came into the community. Obviously, we're hoping to have less vehicles come into the community if we can have more people live closer to where they work. But how does that affect people? So, I mean, I think talking to the businesses that are the larger businesses in the community might be a good idea too, to ask them to survey their staff and give you that information back, or give the consultants the information back. I am concerned, we continue to talk about, of course, by law, ADA, you're going to worry about that. I know that. But then there's this aspect where we have seniors or people with differing abilities that aren't quite to the blue placard level. And then what do we do for those individuals? And that has been a concern, I think, since the Cerro San Luis Neighborhood Greenway was discussed and voted on in 2018, right before I came on to council. It was a large concern for the community members that live there. So are we looking at shuttles for people in key times to come into town? I don't know what that looks like, but if we continue to remove parking, which I am for, so we can create this multimodality, but just we also have to talk about what pairs with that. And if it's more frequency and later hours of the buses, that would be fantastic. I also understand there's ridership challenges with that and money that comes with that. So I see this constant, like, kind of chicken and the egg situation that's happening. I also think that we need to talk about kind of this park and ride situation that happens unofficially in neighborhoods. People that come into neighborhoods and parks so they can go to work and or school. And if they're not staying there for 72 hours, they're not going to get called on and get a ticket unless it's in a parking district. So what does that look like? How do we stop that, unofficial park and ride situation, and not have people come in for 8 hours a day and park in front of someone else's house so they can go to work? And then I do very much agree around the projected development and, what is that going to look like? How is that going to affect parking? And the question around parking districts, I think we have to look into how does that affect parking? We have approved more parking districts since I've been on the council already. And now that we've made this recent change around commercial districts, what's that going to feel like as we continue on? And I think as we expand, I kind of look at, so if we had parking districts everywhere, then what? I think there's that question of how far does that go? So I think that will be important to know. And I definitely agree with Councilmember Schwarzman. I think we have to really look at, the historically marginalized communities and how are they being engaged in this process from the consultants. We, really only since the DEI task force a year ago, year and a half ago, really started making a concerted effort to say, where are these communities and how can we reach out to them? So I'd like to see the consultant company doing the same thing. As far as the number of times, and sure, twice sounds good. I think there's also the whenever you need something from us, I think is, or want some feedback from us is good. Like Vice Mayor Christensen was saying. So I don't need to pin you down to 2 times, but if that seems like the logical amount, that's great. And I hear the 5 years concept, but I also look at between you as staff and the consultants, I feel like you'll give us the best practices as to how often you should come to us. So I definitely want to lean into that. And yeah, 3 years does seem really short though. But I think we've seen a lot of change in parking, and we've seen a lot of change in vehicles and modality. And no, we don't have autonomous cars, but it's a question we're starting to get in our email. And what does that look like with parking? So I don't think we can answer that question right now, but it's technology is happening quickly. So thanks for letting us put in our input, and Councilmember Schwarzman.
Thank you. I just had one other thought in terms of outreach and expanding getting feedback from those who might not otherwise participate in this process. There's been a lot of talk about open town hall and electronic ways of giving feedback, and I think it would be good, especially for those marginalized communities, homeless, people who are older and don't have access to the internet or aren't comfortable using the internet to just maybe do some good old paper surveys with some of these organizations or groups, either businesses that employ people who might not have otherwise participate, or nonprofit organizations who have access to homeless individuals or low-income individuals that can hand them a survey and fill something out on paper so we can get some of those voices heard. Excuse me, I'm gonna drink some water.
Thank you, Councilmember Pease.
Thanks, and thanks for my colleagues' comments. I agree with the additional remarks and I thought that was a good articulation that Vice Mayor Christensen had about the timeline and kind of, and there is a certain amount of pragmatic, right? We're not pretending that within some short period of time we're wand waving and getting rid of cars altogether, right? So there's, we're trying not to frustrate people, I think, is a lot of what the goal is. And I wanted to check, I think it will come in with all of the kind of that curb management, but I'm just thinking about the pain points for the city. And one thing we certainly hear a lot about is kind of that car storage, where folks have that 72-hour and they maybe move it a little bit, and but they're really doing long-term car storage on our public streets. And so I do want to make sure that that gets incorporated into the results of the plan, some kind of an updated approach to that as well. That was it.
Thank you. And I kind of to tag on to Councilmember Shoresman, something I've thought for a while now is, do we reach out to the property managers of affordable housing projects, and actually reaching out to people there might get more connection with people who are in the lower income brackets to be able to get that input out. And they're very busy most likely and not thinking about filling out a survey. So if we can help it make it a little bit easier, that would be great. Council Member Shoresman? Nope. Okay. Vice Mayor Christensen?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the remarks you just made about, homelessness and low-income housing. And I'll just tell you from my experience at TEMA, these folks often, parking isn't, parking is not the issue so much. There are many issues that rise above in terms of their importance for a lot of these populations. When I'm thinking about low income, I'm thinking about, say, hotel workers. And as you've mentioned, hospitality workers, those folks are low income, but they're working low income and they need to park because they got to go to their job. A lot of people who are on disability and that kind of thing in our very low income places are not having to go and park their car for 8 hours while they work. So it's a different kind of, I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that you can talk to everybody parks, but in terms of where the real parking problems are, it's going to be things like that. It's going to be people coming into town for 5 hours. It's going to be people who have to work for 8 hours. It's, it's the vast number of students at Cal Poly and workers at Cal Poly who may not have surface parking lots for very much longer. It's that kind of thing. It's the things we've talked about already. So I just, I think if we talk to a lot of the hotels, the employers, TBID, those kind of folks, you're going to get a lot of our low income people living on the edge who cannot afford high parking costs.
Thank you. City Manager, I saw your hand up. Are you wanting to say something?
I was just going to round up the council's expectations, because I just want to make sure that we're because we've covered a lot of ground tonight, and I want to make sure we're not setting us out in search of the Holy Grail, because this is a short time frame, and the short time frame is deliberate. I tell you in my experience that if you have planning efforts that span changes in councils, add on another 6 months. So we're trying to get this to you before the next council comes in the fall of 2022, so that we've got some consistency across councils, and we're going to do our best to do that. So if you don't mind, Madam Mayor, I'm just going to parrot back what I heard just to make sure that I'm hearing things. Clarity of mission value, missions, emphasis of balance in downtown and the rest of the city. The public outreach seems appropriate, targeted groups rather than ad hoc. We want to look at diversity of perspectives within the groups. And that means a fairly robust public process looking at groups that typically do not participate, with some focus on hospitality, downtown workers, T-bids, and other organizations. We need to resolve the timelines a bit. Want to make sure that there's a balance in focusing on downtown and other areas of the city. In particular, open to parking surveys, focus groups, but rather than a blue sky process, we want to bring in best practices and an assessment by the group, so that we're talking about, here's what we see is of what we heard, here are some ideas, and then test those ideas rather than having kind of blue sky kind of conversations. We need to take a look at projected development throughout the city, and particularly where there's interface between different land use types. We also want to think about the impacts of disabled or seniors and those that maybe don't have the level of mobility, and how does that address with there's going to be some competing interests here between pricing and availability and convenience. Those two always are in competition. There was a mention of the relationship to transit, and I'll just share that, and Matt, maybe you can help me here. I believe our short rate transit plan is up for renewal here soon. I don't know when the feds are going to require us to update that. So there may be takeaways and action items in the plan to look at for the update of our transit plan. And we need to think about in the form of transit, park and ride, and then parking in neighborhoods. And then I think this has come up over the years, is the kind of a real equity question of how parking districts are formed, how are they altered, how are they changed, initiated? Does that still make sense to democratize, all of our parking decisions, or is there a different approach that we want to take about this? Looking for a few meetings with the city council, and we'll look at probably some early start times with the council with some really clear points of where the council wants to be engaged. The horizon for the plan, not necessarily set on that, depends on what the best practice is on term. We also need to address car storage, and I would add to that list oversized vehicles, which I think is not only just car storage, but boats, trailers, trucks, you name it, all that stuff that's using the public right of way. So those are my notes. I just want to make sure that I've gotten everything tonight, because this is an important scoping moment for us. I know I've taken some good notes. I believe the staff has as well, but if there's any omissions and gaps, by all means, we want to hear from you tonight.
Thank you. I think you comprehensively covered the many bits of input that we shared. And we also know this is pie in the sky. We're giving you all the options possible and dream wishes, but it'll be interesting to see what you all come back with. So thank you. So that being said,
I could ask staff to put the motion, sorry.
Okay, you need a motion, yeah. I was just gonna say, is there a motion that someone would like to put on the floor? Councilor Marks.
Yes, I would like to move staff's recommendation and include the various items that the city manager ticked off.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Christensen.
I'll second.
Thank you. Thank you for all of this detail. City Clerk, would you like to read the roll?
Councilmember Marks?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Christensen?
Yes.
Councilmember Pease?
Yes.
Councilmember Shorsman?
Yes.
Mayor Stewart?
Yes, thank you. The motion passes with 5-0. Greatly appreciate this report and hope you have a wonderful evening. So now we come to the liaison reports and communications. Councilmember Marks.
Thank you. Well, on the continuing saga of the Integrated Waste Management Authority is happening, and Pavo Ogren was appointed to be the interim executive director. And the process of amending and ratifying the joint powers agreement is going forward. So things are not happening as quickly as I would like, but they are happening. And so I'm very optimistic about the future. The big challenge is meeting the expenses, the added expenses that the IWMA will incur due to SB 1383, the organic waste recycling mandate, which has come up. So I'll just, keep you guys apprised of that. I did want to also just mention on a somewhat personal note, our decision to move away from the Cal Poly area to San Luis Ranch. And I just wanted to give a little tribute to the neighborhood of permanent residents that has existed, or did exist over the 30 years that we've lived in the neighborhood. And just really quickly, we had a pediatrician, we had a medical equipment leaser, we had someone who did spa supplies, a lot of businesses out of people's homes, law practice, that was my practice. We had a minister, landscaping contractors, the editor of the Tribune, Cal Poly professors and staff, construction companies, CPAs, high school teachers, a firefighter, administrator for the county, daycare center. So it's with some regret that we're leaving the neighborhood, but it's a neighborhood that does not exist anymore of permanent residents. It's all become student housing, and I adore the students, so I'm not against the students, but I'm just facing the reality that basically that's what's happening to the whole neighborhood. So I just wanted to share that a little bit with you guys and the public. So thank you, that's all I have.
Thank you, Councilmember Pease.
Thank you, and thank you, Councilmember Marks, for sharing that tribute in some way. I just wanted to give folks a heads up that SLOCOG is having its next meeting February 2nd. And in that meeting, we pulled for separate consideration of funding the roundabouts on 227 at Buckley and Los Ranchos. And they're a great process to be able to ease that congestion, and really important that we need to improve the movement and safety of 227. And yet there have been a lot of concerns for folks in those neighborhoods. So I just want to let folks know that we will be considering that item separately at the February 2nd meeting. That's it.
Thank you, Councilmember Shorsman.
Yep, just a quick update. I think at the last meeting last week, I mentioned the Slow Climate Coalition's kickoff virtual celebration. This is actually this coming week. It's Thursday. I don't think I had the details at that point, but it's Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Again, it's virtual, so on Zoom, and the information is now on their website under their meetings page. So anybody wants to jump on, I will be at that, and hope to see lots of folks there.
Great, thank you so much. A couple brief announcements as well. Tomorrow at 7 p.m. there will be a virtual webinar between Transitions Mental Health and this local chapter of the Sierra Club. It'll be about mental health and the climate crisis. I will also try to share what we're doing climate-wise at the city at the same panel, so that will be fun. We also last week had the African American Caucus meeting for the League of Cities, and we're getting ready to finalize our names. That should be interesting. We had our policy orientation committee meeting for the California cities for all of the 2022 year and what we'll be doing for all of the different policy committees. So I'll be on the tax and revenue. Remind me, Councilmember Pease, which one you're on?
Economic or environmental quality. So
Thank you.
water, waste, energy.
Thank you. There's some fantastic committees, and the great part about these policy committees is anyone from the public can attend and can see the agendas as well. As we're about to have our meeting next week on the first, or sorry, in 2 weeks on the 1st, it will be Lunar New Year, and we'll be kicking off also Black History Month. So a lot of exciting things happening in the next few weeks, and look forward to seeing you all February 1st at 6 p.m. at our regularly scheduled council meeting. Well, have a great evening all.
Thanks.
Night, everybody.